Hey, what's up? It's Cute What If this side. Today we will be seeing, what if Deku becomes more powerful than All Might? Now before we move ahead with the fic, leave a like and subscribe to the channel for future what ifs like this. The next day was a return to the usual school schedule that Izuku didn't miss very much. He agreed that having pro heroes for teachers was certainly cool, though, and he didn't think that the novelty of that would wear off anytime soon. Even lunch was prepared by a pro hero, which Izuku was especially curious about because one man was cooking for an entire school, and doing so successfully, even providing a multitude of options for them to partake in. Izuku had no idea how the man managed to pull it off, but he was thankful that he did. The only real deviation from traditional schooling was after lunch when the time came for their foundational heroics class. No one knew who their teacher was going to be, and the class was rife with speculation. Izuku had his own suspicions, but he kept quiet about them. There had to have been a reason that Nezu elected not to tell him about All Might teaching at UA, and their dedicated heroics class being the only one with a teacher unaccounted for was too convenient for him to overlook. Yo, Midoriya, who do you think our teacher's gonna be? He looked over to the boy seated to his immediate right, Hantashiro, looking back at him with his perpetual grin. He made a side note to learn more about his quirk later. Meanwhile, he figured he could have a bit of fun with his classmate. All Might, was his simple reply. He expected to catch Shiro off guard with the admittedly ridiculous answer and not elaborate any further to mess with him. What he did not expect was for the entire class to stop and look in his direction. Now, with 19 pairs of eyes on him, one being an especially scrutinizing red-eyed glare, Izuku found himself a deer in headlights. He could even feel the invisible gaze of Hagakure fixed on him 2 seats ahead. All Might, seriously. I don't know if the #1 hero could take time out of his schedule to become a teacher. Well, he did do the recordings for the acceptance letters, so it's possible, ribbit. Deciding to roll with it, he pointedly turned to the door and held out his hand. The class went silent again, and he silently counted down from 5 with his fingers, then he pointed at the door upon reaching 0. The class remained dead silent as they watched the door on the edge of their seats. The tension in the room was only heightened by the sound of footsteps making their way towards the classroom. And then, nothing happened. The class waited in silence for a little while longer to see just who would come through the door. When the door hadn't opened after another 5 seconds, Bakugo turned back to Izuku with a mocking sneer. "Ha, you nerd, there's no way All Might himself." "I am," a familiar voice boomed from outside of the room, coming through the door like a normal person. "Holy shit, it's All Might." Midoriya was right. Is that his Silver Age costume? Izuku slowly craned his head to face the dumbfounded expression of Bakugo, and he gave him a dry smirk before doing a small bow. It was worth it to the greenhead to see the blonde valiantly fight off blowing a gasket in his seat. All Might pressed a button on a remote, and a panel in the wall opened to reveal a set of lockers with numbers corresponding to their seats. After they grabbed the cases containing their costumes, they were herded to the locker rooms to get changed for their first practical lesson in heroics. Izuku sat on a bench and stared down at the unopened case holding his costume. When he first drew up a design at the age of 4, it was heavily inspired by All Might. It even included a cowl with 2 long appendages that were supposed to be reminiscent of All Might's 2 signature locks of hair. As he grew and his hero worship of All Might slowly diminished into something less fanatical, he revisited and reworked the costume idea. He wanted to keep the influence of All Might, as the insurmountable mountain of a man was still his hero, but he also wanted to pay homage to his mother's costume for her efforts in getting him to this point in the first place. The end result was a black spandex suit with white flame decals traveling up the sides of his abdomen and down his legs, as well as a reflective flame symbol on his that the notes in the case assured was as flameproof as the rest of the suit. He wore a pair of white gloves and a matching pair of white boots, and on his waist was a green utility belt as a nod to his mother since he felt wrong not having green anywhere in the costume otherwise. Completing the ensemble was a white cape that he included as a callback to All Might's older costumes. He requested the cape to be made of a special material that allowed him to remove it and use it as a capture weapon, similar to the capture scarf used by Eraserhead. Wait a minute, Izuku thought with a contemplative frown. So, that's who Aizawa is. How did I not piece that together sooner? After getting dressed into his costume, he started to make his way towards ground beta, noticing someone begin to walk in step with him. "I was expecting a lot more color for the rainbow comet," the blonde kid with the black lightning bolt in his hair playfully remarked. This was it, a casual social situation with someone he hadn't explicitly befriended. He somehow made it through the interaction with Zero and the resulting mishap in class unscathed, so he knew he could make it through this one too. He wasn't going to mess this up. "My quirk provides enough color as it is," he responded with a totally unrehearsed laugh. Any more color on the suit would have been overkill. "Ha, I hear you," Kaminari replied with a smile. "Wow, I made it through that. I should ask him about his quirk," Izuku excitedly thought before taking a breath and calming down. "No, I'll wait until after class. I'll probably see it in action again, anyway." The bulk of the class reached ground beta to see All Might waiting on them. He proudly looked over their costumes until his eyes landed on Izuku, and his breath hitched. There were certainly differences, but watching the boy walk out in his black jumpsuit, white boots, and oh so familiar white cape gave him incredibly warm and painful flashbacks. One for all buzzed inside of him again, and he swore that he could faintly hear a voice shouting in the back of his mind, "That's him, that's him. Yes, that's him, my successor," he thought to himself seemingly in confirmation. "No, you blonde buffoon, that's my grandson," shouted a woman wearing a similar getup to Izuku in a black, foggy void. "He still can't hear you, Nana," a shorter, high-colored man sighed in exasperation. All Might shook himself out of his stupor and regained his signature grin. "The clothes really do make the man." "Izuku, I love your costume," Ochako bubbly chirped beside him. "I was expecting a little more color, though. I wanted to pay homage to my mom's costume and All Might's while still making something of my own," he chuckled. "I'm not sure how much I love the cape, though, now that I'm wearing it. Your costume is really cool, too. I can definitely see the space motif you're going for." Ochako beamed at the recognition, and then her smile faltered a bit. "I'm glad you noticed. I wanted something a little more puffy, though, sorta like 13's suit. This one's a little skin tight." Then, something occurred to her. "I've never seen your mom's costume. It's like mine, but greener and no cape," Izuku answered simply. Izuku could have sworn that he caught the eye of Gyro, but she quickly looked away, so he pushed it out of his mind. Costume were the simultaneous thoughts of Bakugo and Todoroki as they overheard that bit of the conversation. Since when was Auntie and Koa Ing hero? So, his mother is a pro that would provide a motive and an opportunity. All Might cut into their radically different rumination by explaining what their first class would be: a battle trial. He explained that the class would be divided into teams of 2. The teams would face off against each other in a mock scenario where one team played the role of villains holding a large bomb within a building, and the other team would play the role of heroes attempting to thwart them. He held out a box for them to draw lots for what team they'd be a part of, and Izuku found himself on Team J. He looked to Ochako, but she, unfortunately, was on Team C. He looked around for his partner as the class started to group up until he felt something pat him through his cape. Turning around, he saw no one, and he was confused until a floating glove waved at him. "Hi there, guess we're partners for today," Hagakure excitedly said. Izuku blinked, and then he returned the smile he was certain she was sending him. "I guess we are." He noticed that she was wearing a pair of gloves and shoes, but he couldn't see anything else. Before he could ask about it, their teacher's voice filled the area. "Now, for the first group," All Might bellowed as he reached into a box with labeled slips of paper. "The hero team will be Team J." "Oh wow, we have to go first," Hagakure said while Izuku focused his eyes on the box in All Might's hands. "And the villain team will be Team B." Izuku looked around for any team to perk up in acknowledgement, and his eyes landed on the feral grin of Bakugo and cold glare of Todoroki directed back at him. "Got him it." Inko stepped into Principal Nezu's office with a contemplative frown. She was on her break, and that usually entailed sitting in the teacher's lounge reading trashy romance novels with Snipe while Aizawa pretended to not fanboy in her presence across the room. But Nezu specifically called her into the office rather than sending her a text. That likely meant that whatever it was, he didn't want a written record of it. "You wanted to see me?" Sir Inko questioned with a raised eyebrow. "You may drop the formalities for this meeting," Nezu assured. "Today, we are equals once again." "So, this is about a case, then," Inko quickly surmised. "That case in particular, yes," he confirmed. Inko's frown deepened. "You have a new lead." Nezu nodded and pulled out several articles from his desk. "It's a tenuous one, but I feel there's something here. Within the past year and a half, there has been a steady uptick in hit pieces directed at UA, its staff, and myself as the principal. It ranged from simple things like expulsions potentially creating vigilantes and villains, to not so simple things like singling out UA for creating child soldiers to fight for the public's amusement in the sports festival." Inko took a careful look through the articles in concern until one thing stood out to her. "These are all from the same publisher. So, you noticed." Nezu nodded with a smile. "At first, I wasn't sure if it was just a single writer or publisher with an axe to grind against UA for one reason or another, but I do love a good investigation." A further look into this Shueisha publishing didn't reveal anything out of the ordinary, which I expected. However, a look into their executive director and occasional writer, Chitos Kazuki, unearthed some interesting details. "Do tell," Inko said while sitting down across from him. "When I had people go undercover into different quirkist groups I suspected were being financially supported. One of them was a larger group primarily congregating on a message board that had monthly meetups for demonstrations and recruitment." Nezu took a sip of tea from a cup that Inko was certain wasn't there initially, but she learned years ago to stop questioning it. "During one of those meetups, my operative was able to accompany the moderator of the message board to a meeting with a woman fitting Kazuki's description. It was a handoff of information, though we're still not certain exactly what information was given." "How can you be sure that it's the same woman?" Inko ventured, to which Nezu only retrieved a picture and slid it across the desk to her. "Ah, point taken," she responded upon seeing the picture. "So, you think she's directly involved with the MLA?" Nezu nodded. "Being a middleman that only runs information between parties wouldn't be worth the time of someone with her position, and it would also be an equally large waste of an asset. As the executive director of a major news publication, she no doubt has considerable influence over information distribution to the public. And that means the MLA already had a steady influence on information flow irrespective of their indoctrination schemes, and co-added. That definitely recontextualizes all of the news that comes out of there. It also means that UA is directly in their crosshairs if these hit pieces are any indication. A small, dangerous smile bearing more teeth than Inko was comfortable with developed onto Nezu's face. Yes, I suppose we are. Inko would be lying if she said she didn't begin to sweat at his predatory tone. It appears that war may come sooner than we had anticipated. So that's the story between me and Bakugo, and that's why I'm fairly sure that he's going to abandon the bomb entirely to come directly after me. Izuku finished explaining with a sigh. Oh no, I'm sorry for making you relive all of that, Hagakure exclaimed, frantically waving her gloved hands. It's fine, he quickly assured her. I'm getting past it, and it's better to know these things now before they potentially result in disaster later on. Well, we have a few minutes left. Got a plan in that green noggin of yours? Izuku's smile returned with an edge to it. I do, actually. I take it that you're pretty good at sneaking around. She nodded, but when he stayed silent, she remembered that he couldn't see her, so she gave him a thumbs up. Right? Well, I'd normally suggest that you sneak your way through the building and locate the bomb while I keep Bakugo busy, but Todoroki has a pretty powerful ice quirk, and I'm not certain how far it reaches. Given your costume situation, you might catch hypothermia if you're frozen, and I'm not around to thaw you out and heat you back up. So, you just want to stay around and keep me warm, Hushi playfully teased. Basically, he casually replied. She huffed, lamenting her failed attempt to get a rise out of him. What about I'll explodey? How hard can you hit? Pretty hard. Izuku hummed in consideration. Punch me in the gut as hard as you can. Goo, are you sure? She hesitantly questioned. Yes, I've seen Bakugo take a hard hit and keep on going on pure spite and hatred alone. He's no doubt gotten tougher since then, so I just want to measure what we're working with, he responded. Give it all you got, I can take it. Okay, she reluctantly accepted. Izuku flexed his abs and mentally prepared himself for the coming blow. He didn't want to underestimate the girl, so he readied himself for a hit as if he himself was throwing it. He was not at all prepared to be folded over an invisible arm with a gloved fist firmly planted in his stomach. His eyes were bulging out of his skull, and he just barely kept his very soul from being ejected from his body on impact. He fell to his knees and hacked his life away while Hagakure apologetically fretted over him. Holy hell, it feels like I just got hit by a Texas smash. Izuku struggled between breaths, and he flashed her a wobbly grin. You've got a mean straight punch. Well, when your whole thing is being invisible, you gotta develop some other talents to keep up. She sheepishly chuckled with a not so insignificant measure of pride. I think we'll be just fine, Izuku told her with a confident smile. Your 10-minute prep time has concluded. All Might's voice blared over their earpieces. Go. Listen up, Mr. Freeze. I'm hunting down Deku and beating him into the ground. I don't care what you do, just stay out of my way, Bakugo snarled at Todoroki. Todoroki's impassive stare did not falter for a second as he walked past Bakugo and placed his right hand on the wall. There won't even be a fight, and I don't need your help. Bakugo might have been intimidated by his chilly tone if not for the ridiculously goofy ice prosthetic covering his left side with a glowing red eye. Instead, he just felt even more annoyed. That annoyance became shock when Todoroki froze the entire building in an instant. Turning away from him, Todoroki calmly walked towards the door amidst Bakugo's silence. They're done. Let's capture them and get this over with, he coldly instructed. That snapped Bakugo out of his stupor, and his annoyance returned tenfold. Don't order me around, Ice Terminator. Izuku felt the sudden, abrasive cold before his quirk activated on instinct with a flash of orange, and the hallway they were in glaciered in the blink of an eye. As if on a mental command, the hallway was blanketed in a deep crimson, and the red flames of his quirk quickly melted the surrounding ice. Looking over to check on his partner, he was greeted with the sight of Hagakure wrapped in a snug-looking blanket of orange fire. If her head movements were any indication, she was just as confused as he was. Huh, I forgot I could do that, Izuku calmly stated. You forgot, Hagakure shouted. I thought your quirk was just colorful fire that lets you move fast sometimes. What even is this? Izuku could tell from her hands curiously probing and examining the orange fire blanketing her that her tone was less accusatory and more excitedly inquisitive. Well, I can separate my quirk into individual flames that each allow me to do different things, he answered. It's kind of a lot to explain, so I'll just say that red gives me even more intense hate in localized areas, and I've only ever used orange once at the entrance exam. I think it forms barriers that I can protect people with. But it activates subconsciously thus far. That is so uncool. My grandson is so uncool. The vestiges of One for All were watching the battle trial through the unwitting eyes and ears of All Might, and they could hear Izuku's explanation to go along with the showcase of his quirk. Nana was positively over the moon with pride at her grandson, while En and Degoro Banjo were shaking their heads in amused exasperation. Banjo could definitely concede that Nana's grandson had looked pretty cool up to that point, though. Hikage Shinomori and Yoichi Shigaraki, however, were watching the scene with critical eyes, Yoichi especially. Is that? Hikage began. Singularity, Yoichi finished. Looks like it. Sheesh, Hikage sighed. You think 8th is going to try to pass it on to him? I certainly hope not, Yoichi replied. 2 quirks reaching singularity within one person. I'd rather none and not have to watch her successor clean the remains of her grandson off of the floor and walls. Izuku retracted the protective orange shield and focused his quirk in melting a path down the hall for the two. It didn't take long for them to realize that Todoroki had frozen the entire building. Hey, Midori, Hagakure spoke up. Momentarily taken aback by the nickname, Izuku stumbled. Midori, you've poured your heart and soul to me in our first conversation and saved me from being frozen, and I've folded you over my fist for science. I think we've already advanced to being best friends today. That's fair, Izuku conceded with a chuckle. I don't have a cool nickname for you yet, unfortunately. Just Toru is fine. Roger that. What did you need? Well, since Todoroki froze the building, how likely is it that he thinks we're frozen too and left the bomb unguarded to capture us? Izuku froze for a moment as he hadn't considered that, and his eyes lit up with another plan. How well do you think you can sneak around on ice? I used to train by silently navigating through a room covered in broken glass. Ice will be child's play, Toru confidently replied. Awesome. I'll find a large enough room and make a ton of noise to draw them to my position while you find the bomb. Aye aye, Captain Toru said with a mock salute and scampered off down the hall. Izuku made his way down the hall in the other direction, passing through the corridors to find an empty room that was suitable enough for the distraction. He knew that he'd likely end up taking on both Bakugo and Todoroki, so he needed room to dodge explosions and more glaciers. He wasn't sure if they'd work well together, however, but he'd make them pay for it if they didn't. Finally finding an optimal room, he ignited his red flames and melted the ice, even subliming it directly into steam at points. The room was filled with steam and slippery patches of mostly melted ice, and Izuku's flames of ruby transitioned to emerald like Gen 3, and he clapped his hands together as hard as he could to both clear the room and create a thunderous boom to draw his two opponents to his location. All he had to do now was wait. So he waited, and waited, and waited. After around 15 seconds, he started to get a little impatient, so he took a shot in the dark and speculated that they were waiting outside the room in case it was a trap. With that in mind, he decided to push the easiest button he knew of to get the show on the road. Hey, Bakugo, I'm better than you and you know it. The hell you are, you bastard. Bakugo bounded down the hall and into the room with a vicious snarl. The bright sunshine of Izuku's yellow fire took over, and he darted out of the way of the furious blonde's initial explosion. Bakugo threw an explosion at him again, and Izuku dodged again and again ... and again. They kept up the intense game of cat and mouse with Bakugo launching himself at Izuku with explosion after explosion. Meanwhile, Izuku dodged each one with an apparent ease that felt so mocking to Bakugo. The boy was practically bouncing around the room like a yellow pin, and Bakugo was getting incredibly sick of it. The intermittent kicks and punches he received whenever Izuku bounded past him that often came close to knocking the wind out of him were not helping matters, either. Stop dodging and face me, Deku, he commanded. Izuku, feeling the strain begin to set in on his, obliged him and landed in a crouch in front of him, deactivating his quirk all the while. Bakugo felt truly insulted in that moment by him deactivating his quirk, and he would make the boy pay for it in. Don't you daring look down on me, you piece of shit. Bakugo threw himself at Izuku in his rage, telegraphing a right hook that Izuku was more than happy to exploit by hooking the arm, and using the blonde's own momentum to toss him over his hip and onto the concrete. It was a scene very reminiscent of their schoolyard scuffle 5 years prior, and Bakugo knew that all too well. He stared up at Izuku with wide eyes, feeling just as bewildered as he did back then. He felt just as small, just as insignificant. He felt just as inferior. Izuku only had a fraction of a second to notice Bakugo's 1,000-yard stare before his instinct screamed at him once again, and he went back up in yellow fire to just barely dodge the pillar of ice that slammed through where he once stood, carefully skirting around Bakugo to avoid freezing him as well. I told you this would be a trap, came the annoyed voice of Todoroki from the entrance. You clearly can't finish this yourself, so I will. Izuku, feeling an almost alien rush of confidence and snark, decided to roll with it and respond. You're more than welcome to try, Terminator. Holy hell, he even got your one-liners, Banjo laughed alongside Nana, who was currently using En's collar to wipe the tears of joy from her face. Right, and look at how well my little baby and co-trained him. He's moving even better than me, Nana cried. Yoichi quietly sighed with a mixture of fondness and dismay. The boy looked like he'd make for a great ninth wielder, but it just wasn't in the cards. That invisible girl, though, she did have a wicked right. Izuku was mildly disappointed at the lack of verbal or facial response from the heterochromatic teen, but he didn't have time to dwell on it since he was busy dodging the resulting ice spikes that shot at him. They were faster than Bakugo's explosions, however, and he only narrowly avoided being skewered on a few occasions. After the 5th tier on his costume, he decided to switch tactics. He put out his yellow fire and green took its place, and he met the next mini-glacier with a solid right hook, smashing into the ice with enough force to shatter it entirely. Momentarily taken aback, Todoroki only acted in instinct when blasting another mini-glacier to block the split-second advance by the newly golden Izuku, trapping him in the ice in front of him. Putting his confusion at the boy's constant changing of color and powers aside, he exhaled his tension away at a seemingly apprehended foe. That relief was short-lived, though, as the ice flashed red and practically blew apart with the green head forcing his way out shrouded in crimson fire. The heat became too much for even him to deal with, and he quickly backed off. Or, rather, he backed off as quickly as he could manage since the frostbite from overusing his ice started to hit him. The sluggishness would come to bite him, as he received a left hook to the jaw and a boot to the sternum in rapid succession for his troubles. Midoriya was beginning to become a truly troublesome opponent. Izuku, meanwhile, wasn't faring much better. The strain was really beginning to hit him, as well, and he didn't need Recovery Girl whacking him with her cane again. He wanted to prolong the fight as long as possible to give Toru time to find the objective, but it looked more and more as though he needed to end the fight quickly if he didn't want to be captured, and leave her to fend for herself 2-on-1. The two teens intensely stared each other down as they picked up that the other was slowing, and they both knew that the end for one of them was near. All these years, came a raspy, feral growl to the side of them. They broke eye contact and looked over to see an absolutely tempestuous-looking Bakugo clutching his right gauntlet. All these years you've been looking down on me, those extras only add up to me, and those shitty teachers tried to use me as their patsy. I'm no one's pawn, I'm no one's stepping stone, and I'm no one's measuring stick. I'm the best, and that's all I'll ever be, he roared and yanked the pin from his gauntlet with both Izuku and Todoroki in the line of fire. The resulting explosion was gargantuan, shaking the building and weakening the structural integrity even more than flash freezing it did. Bakugo panted at ground zero, watching intently for any signs of movement. He was both relieved and enraged when there was movement in the rubble ahead of him, and a soot-covered Izuku sporting a freshly torn costume emerged with the barely conscious Todoroki hanging off his arm. The glare Bakugo received from those emerald eyes was so frigid that he was rooted in place. The blonde swore he saw flickers of black enter the boy's eyes and spark in his green hair. It was exponentially more threatening than the contemptuous glare he received half a decade prior in the alleyway. Izuku, meanwhile, felt an unfamiliar level of rage leak into him the longer he laid eyes on the blonde. The blackness he briefly felt that day months before the entrance exam was returning much hotter than previously, and Izuku struggled to keep a lid on it out of fear of what sort of damage it could do if he didn't. Then, a chunk of ice slammed down onto the back of Bakugo's head, and he limply fell into unconsciousness. Izuku's surprise gave him the opportunity he needed to swallow that blackness and lock it away again. He looked over to the limp form of Bakugo to find capture tape floating above him and proceed to wrap around the boy. "Midori, what the hell happened down here?" the voice of Toru shouted from above Bakugo's captured form. Toru asked in confusion. "I thought you were looking for the bomb. I felt that massive explosion and figured you might need help," she frantically reasoned. "Ah, that," he bemusedly chuckled. "You came at the perfect time. I am absolutely spent. I can see that you're barely standing up straight with him unconscious on your arm," she giggled. Izuku looked over to see that Todoroki was indeed slumped over in unconsciousness. "Huh, so he is." He removed his cape with his free hand and appeared to twirl it, forming it into a thinner piece of fabric that wrapped tightly around Todoroki. Hero team wins," came the shocked voice of All Might through their earpieces. "Awesome," Izuku breathed out. "Please catch me," he said before slipping into unconsciousness himself and falling forward with Toru scrambling to keep him from hitting the ground. The control room was silent. The entire class, teacher included, could only stare at the screen, mouths agape. No one moved a muscle until All Might snapped out of it and sprung into action, leaping out of the room and toward the building to collect his 3 unconscious students. The rest of the class was left to make sense of the titanic clash they had just witnessed. 3 of the strongest kids in their class just beat the piss out of each other, and one of them may have tried to commit murder against the other 2 and, in the end, the winner was still the guy who was outnumbered in the first place. "How in the are we supposed to follow that?" Kaminari shouted, voicing what just about everyone was thinking. Izuku awoke to the unfortunate sight of white walls and the unfortunate feeling of a hospital bed. He immediately deflated when he realized where he was. "I thought I told you not to overdo it again," Recovery Girl scolded him at his bedside. "Would you believe that I didn't have a choice again?" he offered with a sheepish smile. The old medic sighed in resignation, knowing that it was the truth. "When Tashinori came in with you 3, he explained what happened. I want to be upset at you, but you weren't the one being reckless this time around." Her face scrunched in frustration. He should have stopped the match, and Bakugo shouldn't have gone as far as he did. "But we're here now, and from what Tashinori told me, you seem to know restraint again this time around, so I'll give you props for that." Izuku was just glad that he wouldn't be getting whacked in the head. "You're thinking too loudly, young man," Recovery Girl smirked after lightly whacking him with her cane. Her smile then softened to a kind one. "You didn't go overboard and hurt yourself with your quirk, so all you needed was some rest to regain your stamina. You're good to go." "Thanks, Recovery Girl." Izuku returned her smile and shuffled out of bed and out of the room. He noticed that he passed the unconscious figures of Todoroki and Bakugo on his way out, but he didn't stop to check on them. He had faith in Recovery Girl, and he also had a sinking feeling that Bakugo would be in some shit when he awoke, which he wanted no part of. He made it back to ground beta in time for the rest of the class to be headed back to the locker rooms, and he was immediately tackled by an invisible missile. Midoriya Toru gleefully shouted. Izuku momentarily blue-screened at being hugged with no warning by the one person other than his mother who can consistently sneak up on him, largely because she was still practically naked. She seemed to realize this, and she sheepishly stepped back and gave him some space. That space was not to be, however, as a second blur in the form of Ochako slammed into him and accidentally negated his gravity, causing him to float into the air above the class while struggling in vain to right himself. Ochako quickly cancelled her quirk, and he plummeted right into the arms of Shoji. "Sup," Shoji said after a moment of silence. "Yo," Izuku replied just as casually as if he wasn't in a bridal carry. "You are strong." "So are you," Shoji replied with mirth edging into his voice. "Fair enough," Izuku replied with a light smile, and the taller boy led him back down to his feet. The moment he was back on solid ground, the entire class surrounded him. "Dude, that fight was so manly," Kirishima shouted. "Where did you learn to move like that? I could hardly follow you," Zero asked. "Did you train at a dojo?" Ajiro asked. "I can't believe Bakugo tried to blow you two up. I mean, I can, but still," Ashido shouted in frustration. That frustration seemed like it was much too familiar to her. Now, children, please do not crowd him. He just recovered from an intense battle." Thankfully came the voice of All Might, and the class gave the boy some much appreciated space. All Might watched as he nervously answered their questions and shyly accepted their praise. It was a stark contrast from the alert, self-assured teen he was in the heat of battle. It brought a genuine smile to the number one's face. Internally, One for All was a different story. "Let me at the little shit, I'll tear him apart for trying to hurt my boy," Nana practically snarled while being restrained by Banjo. "NN. Why are we even holding her back? It's not like she can leave the void and hurt him for real," Banjo queried to end through strained grunts in their efforts to keep the apoplectic grandmother contained. "I'd rather not test if she could find a way," En replied with equal strain. Bakugo felt like utter crap. He had a killer headache and his body was as sore as all hell, but the real casualty was his pride. His pride had been beaten, flogged, tarred, and feathered before being paraded through the public square for the townspeople to throw tomatoes at. In other words, he was not feeling good, physically or emotionally. He had been nothing short of embarrassed in the battle trial by Deku. He couldn't land a single blow on Deku when he was using his quirk. Deku easily countered his attack and put him on his ass again when he wasn't using his quirk. Deku danced around him and put him in his place, and he made it look easy while he was doing it. At least half and half looked like he made Deku work for it. Deku looked like he actually had to try against the peppermint bastard, but he, himself, was nothing but a warm-up. That hurt. That really hurt. Not only did Deku surpass him over the past 5 years, but he wasn't even second to the greenhead. He wasn't even sure if he was third. Who the hell knew what that walking pocket dimension chick was capable of when shit got serious? He winced, and his hand went up to cradle his head. He had no idea what the hell hit him, but it left him with the worst headache he had ever experienced. It was the maraschino cherry on top of the horseshit sundae of a day. "How's your head, young man?" The voice of an old lady piped up beside his bed. He would forgive himself for not noticing her this time around, but he wouldn't make a habit of allowing people to sneak up on him. "It feels like foggy shit," he murmured. "I'm not surprised," she remarked. "Getting a chunk of ice slammed directly to the skull will do that to you. You're lucky to only have a concussion from that." A chunk of ice, he confusedly thought until it hit him. "The invisible girl," he growled out. "You don't get to be bitter, boy," she scolded while stepping aside and allowing the still unconscious Todoroki into view. "Look at what you did to your partner with that last explosion." Bakugo was taken completely off guard. He hadn't really thought about the last attack he pulled in his rage-fueled haze until that very moment, and he internally winced. Then, he physically winced when he saw the rough state Todoroki was in. There weren't any scars beyond the one he already had, but his costume was practically burned away, and he looked rather beaten up. He couldn't determine how much of that was from him and how much was from Deku, but that wasn't the point. "I'd rip into you for your absolutely comical level of recklessness that could have gotten yourself and others killed or seriously hurt, but someone else is waiting outside to speak to you first, and anything I say would either be redundant or much nicer than what you're about to get," Recovery Girl huffed before closing the curtain separating his and Todoroki's beds, and then she walked away to open the door. "Who the hell wants to talk to me?" he muttered lowly to no one in particular. "I do," was the curt reply of a very familiar voice. He craned his head to inspect the new arrival, and he saw a woman wearing a black spandex suit with a green mask to match her green gloves, and green hair. "Oh, I'd scold you for the language, but I think that's pretty apropos for your situation, so I'll allow it just this once," she replied in a clipped tone. Bakugo's brain was busy catching up with the situation. Standing in front of him was Auntie Inko in a hero costume that he had no idea she even owned. He foggily remembered Deku talking with round face about it, but it was a ridiculous thought at the time, and seeing it was very different than hearing about it. Regardless, she looked pissed. In fact, she looked beyond pissed. She looked absolutely livid in a very calm, frigid way that he knew only she could. He had only gotten in trouble with her once before when he and Deku were very young, and once was more than enough. He realized that she was glaring at him just like Deku was in the battle trial, but it was a little different. The same rage in his eyes was present in hers, but hers was violently composed and seemed to be molded into a sharp edge ready to stab into him at a moment's notice, as opposed to Deku's that was a barely contained inferno primed to burn him and the rest of the building to ashes. She wasn't speaking, either. The silence hung heavy in the air as he actually started to wilt under her glare, something that never happened to Katsuki Bakugo. He never backed down from anything or anyone, and he valiantly tried to meet her stare head-on. But the oppressive aura of murder and maternal fury that dwarfed even his own mother's was almost suffocating. "What the hell were you thinking?" Katsuki and Ko finally asked in a measured tone. And that was a great question. What exactly was he thinking when he aimed his gauntlet at Deku and Mr. Freeze and pulled the pin? Was he thinking about how furious he was for being inferior to Deku of all people? Was he thinking about how much it aided him that he was a pawn in some head scheme that drove Deku away to become that powerful in the first place? What about how much it stung to not only be proven inferior to Deku but to Peppermint Butler as well? Was he thinking about all the years he swore to himself and everyone else that he was indisputably the best, only for it to all just be a convoluted fabrication? Was it that his whole belief that he was the best might have been in part propped up by the designs of a group of terrorists that didn't truly believe in him, only in what his success could do for themselves in the future? He didn't really know what to say. He didn't know how to answer her question or any of his own. He didn't know which question was the answer to her question, so he just spilled all of them to her. He told her every question, every conundrum, every doubt, every contradiction, and every passing thought he had. Ko remained silent throughout the entire explanation. In all honesty, it was less of an explanation and more of the blonde unloading years of bottled-up insecurities that he'd been holding on to since he was 10. Her glare had softened over the course of his venting, but her face was still kept carefully blank. He couldn't read her face at all for what she was thinking, and it made him nervous, but he was already neck-deep in flushing whatever was left of his pride. When he was finished, or, more accurately, when he had nothing left inside of him to spill, his mouth snapped shut, and the two stared at each other for what felt like hours to the blonde. If the clock was to be believed, it had only been 2 minutes. "Katsuki," she finally spoke up, "I'm going to tell you a story, and I want you to be silent and not interrupt until I'm finished. I'll tell you when I'm finished. Understood?" He nodded, and she grabbed a lone chair to sit down in. "When I was in high school, I didn't have many friends. Truth be told, I had 2 of them. You can probably make a guess as to who one of them was, but that isn't the point. My 2 friends were all I really had. I'm not sure if Izuku ever told you, but I'm adopted. My adoptive parents were loving, certainly. But it was also very clear that they adopted in the first place out of the aesthetic of having a complete family unit. They were well off, so they could afford to do it and not really think about it, and they weren't always emotionally available people. For a long time, my 2 best friends were the center of my world. They felt like the family that I often wished my own family could have been. Both times." She sighed, keeping herself on track and away from any tangents. Bakugo was still silent, paying rapt attention to her every word despite not yet seeing any relevance. "I brought that up to give a bit of background for the actual point of this story. I went into the heroics track while they didn't, but they still supported me every step of the way, through graduation and beyond. I was underground, so I didn't interact with limelight heroes much and involved myself with the public and the press as little as possible. Meanwhile, there was a particular limelight hero a little older than myself that did all he could to present himself to the public. He was powerful, too. Still is. Back then, he was everywhere apprehending criminals, rescuing civilians, taking down villains like candy, and he made a flashy show of his strength all the while. I remember him saying at some point that civilians were not points to be earned, and he didn't do any of it for the fame, the wealth, or the notoriety. He just wanted to be the best. He wanted to be number 1. He wanted to step out of the shadow and finally surpass one man all might." Bakugo was still silent, but he wasn't so confused anymore. Beginning aside, he was starting to see why she was telling him this story. He just had no idea where it was going to go. The fundamental problem with that goal is that All Might is not a goal to be surpassed. All Might is barely a man, he's a symbol, an almost theoretical concept of heroics that isn't meant to be outdone, at least not in any practical way. All Might is so inhumanly powerful that attempting to bridge the gap between yourself and him isn't something that anyone would be able to achieve in their lifetime. And that's just regarding power and ignoring the sheer significance his very presence has on our society. Are you still following? At his shaky nod, she continued. "So, what does an insanely prideful man that's so singularly focused on bridging that gap do when he realizes that it just isn't going to happen? What does that man do when he realizes that he can never be the best, especially as he is, and that there will always be at least one person ahead of him for as long as he lived?" Bakugo wasn't sure if the question was rhetorical or if she was legitimately asking him what he thought a man like that would do. He didn't answer either way. She hadn't yet told him that she was finished. What happened was that the man did not let go of his ambitions. He stubbornly held onto them for dear life, even at the cost of those around him. All that mattered to him was surpassing All Might, and if he couldn't do it himself, he would just pass the buck. That came in the form of a cute little homemade eugenics project he cooked up. What the Bakugo couldn't help but spit out, immediately recoiling when he realized that he interrupted her. Ko only chuckled without a trace of mirth in her tone. What is right, she bitterly lamented. He, in his infinite wisdom, figured that he could overcome the weaknesses of his quirk by selectively breeding the weaknesses out of it, creating a perfect offspring that had all of the power and benefits of his own quirk without the mitigating factors that would limit them. Inko's face soured and her tone took a hateful, razor-sharp edge. To do that, however, he needed a proper specimen. He needed someone with biological counters to the roadblocks he faced in his bid for number one. Wouldn't you believe it that one of my best friends was the perfect candidate? Inko's fists tightened in her lap, and Bakugo could see the ocean of raw hatred and malice in her eyes. It was deeply unsettling to see that look in the eyes of a woman he could only remember warm, unfettered kindness from. He went about courting her, and I use that term very loosely. He practically wined and dined her parents into an arranged marriage, and the end result was that he got his disgusting little project off the ground. When the first attempt proved to be a failure, he discarded the adorable little twins with quirks that only functioned well together, but would never function separately. He tried again, and it failed again, so he moved on again. His own children were nothing but tools to him that were disposable when they weren't able to be what he wanted them to be, which was the golden little miracle baby that would grow up to surpass All Might so that he could live vicariously through them. There was no love, no affection, and no real connection, at least from his end. I don't know what happened with the last child my friend and I. We had an argument when she was pregnant. It was bad. We didn't speak for a decade afterward. I did keep tabs on the family, though, and do you know what ultimately the end result of his little eugenics project was? Inko leaned forward and narrowed her eyes at Bakugo. 1 dead child, 3 traumatized children, and a mother that was committed to a mental hospital. All for the sake of surpassing Ing All Might. All for the Ing's sake of finally being the Ing best. Inko leaned back into her chair and away from Bakugo's pale, alarmed expression. So, in review, he never became the best despite his efforts, and he left a dead child, a shattered family, and a likely horrifically traumatized teenager in his wake. That's what happens when you put every fiber of your being into chasing a running ghost. That's what happens when you center your very existence around scaling a mountain that's just too steep to reach the peak of. Bakugo felt as though Inko was performing an autopsy on his soul with just her piercing gaze. You'll end up dead if you're lucky, and you'll end up hurting or killing everyone around you one by one if you're not. And, if the battle trial is any indication, you're already well on your way. Bakugo felt his stomach plummet to the depths of his sphincter at the reminder combined with the Antarctic glare he was receiving. So, Katsuki Bakugo, I've known you since you barely were a gleam in your mother's eye. I know that you want to be the best. I know that you've thought for a long time that you were. I know that no longer being the big man on campus is an unfamiliar and frightening concept for you, and you'll do anything and everything to return to the status quo. I know that you feel used by the teachers at your former school district, and you want to prove that you're the best on your own merits and no one else's. I know that you want to surpass All Might himself one day and sit upon your throne atop the hero rankings. There was a heavy silence as she continued staring at him, fixing him in place as if his answer to whatever question she was building up to would decide his future there and then. Are you willing to sacrifice your humanity in order to do that like many before you have? The question should have been an easy one for Bakugo, and he almost immediately went to give her an emphatic no. However, something stayed his hand after everything she told him. He knew that it was a question that he really needed to think over, as even though it appeared obvious on the surface, thinking about it purely on a surface level would lead him on a path to becoming the poor schmuck in her story. Bakugo could have potentially ended multiple lives that day, and he truly realized that, now. His refusal to be anything less than the best and his desire to wipe out any and every bit of competition very well could have landed him a comfy cell in Tartarus for killing the children of 2 pro-heroes. If the gravity of the conversation hadn't already been weighing on him like a lead suit of armor, that realization would have certainly done so. That wasn't what he wanted to be. That wasn't how he was going to be the best. That wasn't what he would become. No, he resolutely answered. No, I'm not. Inko finally broke a small smile. Good. The smile vanished. Now, your punishment for such unquantifiable stupidity won't be expulsion. Tentatively, any color that might have returned to Bakugo's face drained once again at the mention of expulsion. What do you mean? Because the building wasn't brought down by the explosion and no one was ultimately hurt. The rest of the class was able to continue, just in a different building. That was your only saving grace. You still knowingly tried to commit grievous bodily harm on fellow students during a training exercise, successful or not. This conversation is only happening right now because of pure luck on the part of physics, and your answer just now saved you from a one-way ticket to the villain rehabilitation program at Ketsubutsu Academy. Oh, was all he could say in response. Yeah, oh. In addition to that, you'll be sitting out every heroics class until the sports festival at bare minimum, and you'll be on a probationary period for the rest of the semester in which you will be seeing Hound Dog for compulsory therapy, likely for the foreseeable future. Up again, even the slightest misstep, and you'll be lucky to land in general studies. She leaned forward again, and her eyes narrowed into slits. Up nearly as badly as you did today, and there won't be a body to send to Ketsubutsu. Are we clear? Bakugo frantically nodded. He was very willing to admit to himself that Inkoing terrified him, though he wouldn't say so out loud. Good, she curtly replied before standing up and walking to the door. I'll inform Principal Nezu of your acceptance of the terms. Let's not have this conversation again. Have you been a pro-hero this entire time? Bakugo called out to the retreating woman. She stopped and stood in front of the door without turning back. I retired shortly before Izuku was born. Was it because of that other pro? She did not immediately answer. It was one of several reasons. Ultimately, I lost faith in heroics. She turned her head to look at him, and she offered him a small smile. Izuku helped me find some of it. With that, she was gone, and Bakugo was left to ruminate on everything that was said. Little did he know, he wasn't the only one. In the bed next to him, separated by a curtain, laid a witty Shoto Todoroki. I just don't get how you always know when I'm behind you. Are you sure that super hearing isn't part of your seemingly 6-in-1 quirk? Ochako huffed as she and Izuku were nearing the gates of UA the next morning. I think we're at 7-in-1 at this point, Izuku offhandedly remarked. And no, you just have to know what to listen for, like the heavy steps of Ida Power walking to school behind us. Ochako turned around in confusion, and, sure enough, Ida was rapidly making his way toward them in typical Ida fashion. She turned a quizzical eye back to Izuku, who only playfully smirked back at her. It also helps to always be listening for something, he added. So, paranoia? She dryly questioned. Hey, a little healthy paranoia is never a bad thing. You never know when your dad might return from the grave to finish the job, after all. What? She did not get an answer or the opportunity to press that alarming detail as Ida caught up with them, and attempted to quickly herd them towards their school. It was merely an attempt, however, as the gates of the building were surrounded by a sea of reporters. Cameras and microphones were being shoved into the faces of any and every student that passed through for the slim possibility that they could get a scoop, update, or any morsel of information on the rumors of All Might teaching at the high school. The three friends struggled to navigate their way through the rush of ravenous press until the sight of their homeroom teacher filled them with hope that they'd survive the onslaught. However, through the cavalcade of questions about All Might's teaching status, if he was a competent teacher, or if lunch rushes was 50% cocaine like the rumors claimed, one particular question stood out to Izuku. UA claimed to have lifted the restrictions on quirkless applicants and now allows quirkless students to enroll. Is that true? Izuku stopped in his tracks, and he turned to the woman who posed the question. She had pale blue skin, lilac hair, and green eyes with sunken, black sclere. She was giving him a smile that was filled with genuine curiosity, but something about it gave him an inkling of warning in his gut. Well, I haven't personally encountered any yet, but I doubt that anyone who is quirkless would seek to out themselves, especially if they came from a district that was shut down, he answered. He almost missed the slight twitch in her eye at the mention of the district shutdowns, but it was so brief that he questioned if he imagined it in the first place. Care to expand on that? She questioned further without missing a beat. Izuku internally debated on if he should continue the impromptu interview or continue on to class. Most of the other reporters were busy hounding other students and teachers, but he did notice that a scant few had turned their attention to him. Screw it. They came for a story, so let's give them one. Looking the woman in the eye, he spoke. Yes, actually. I think I can speak from a unique position, as I also came from a district that was torn apart and shut down for quirkism and discrimination, and I had the unfortunate situation of being a late bloomer. I spent the majority of my life believing that I was quirkless. Her eyes widened a fraction, and the curiosity that was already written on her face seemed to double. A few of the other reporters leaned in closer as well at the development. You were quirkless and still worked on your abilities enough to make it into the hero course. Do go on. I was fortunate enough to have people in my corner to help me achieve my dream, quirk or not. That support was the driving force that allowed me to get to this point, even before I eventually developed my quirk. His expression fell and became more solemn. Unfortunately, not everyone is a late bloomer, and even less people have that kind of support behind them. That's an issue, and either not enough heroes make an effort to address it, or their efforts aren't publicized and don't reach the people really in need. And you want to be that hero? She asked him. You want to be a symbol for the public, similar to All Might. No, not like All Might, he quickly answered. I could never live up to that, and, frankly, I feel like my efforts would be much better served trying to help those that not even All Might could reach. Even with the pillar propping up society, people still slip through the cracks. Someone has to be there to extend a helping hand out from the darkness and into the light. So a symbol for the disenfranchised, then she asked, maintaining her smile that he still wasn't entirely comfortable with. If that's the easiest way to phrase it, then sure, he answered. Well, I'd love to interview you for Shueisha in a few years when you've graduated, she chirped a little too enthusiastically. Before he could respond, a white cloth wrapped around him and started tugging him backward towards the gates of UA. That's enough of that, you're already late, said a tired and irritated Aizawa. He led Izuku through the gates and walked away from the mass of reporters that were trying to find a way around the security system for their All Might scoops. Once inside the building, he turned an annoyed glare to the teen. Why are you talking to the press, Midoriya? The boy in question sheepishly scratched the back of his head. They wanted a scoop, so I gave them something to chew on that would satisfy enough of them to leave the premises. It cuts down the number of marauders vying for out there. The gate has a security system in place for a reason. He tiredly responded. All you really accomplished was shining a spotlight on yourself through the chaos, regardless of the noble intent. You heard what I said, Izuku asked with a quirked eyebrow. Yes, and even if I hadn't, it'll most likely be on the internet later today. Now, again, you're late, so get to class. But we're going to the same place, so if I'm late, doesn't that mean you're late too? The long-suffering sigh that escaped the scraggly man's lips was enough for Izuku to dart through the halls and arrive at 1A's door. Dodging the reprimand from Ida about his tardiness when he stepped inside, he noticed the smoldering yet contemplative look on Bakugo's face that was fixed downward onto his desk. He also noticed the way that Todoroki looked at him with a mixture of bitterness, contempt, and another emotion that he couldn't really identify. Aizawa entered the room shortly after him, and he addressed the room after they got quiet. 5 seconds. Better, but still not great. Anyway, I reviewed the footage from the battle trials yesterday. Most of you did well enough, although there's room for improvement for all of you. We'll be going over them individually later today during your heroics class, and I'll give you each proper feedback then. His eyes fixed themselves onto Bakugo with a glare. I trust you've already been given your official punishment, so I'll only say that if you try anything as monumentally stupid as that again, I'll expel you before Verdant even has the chance to break your limbs. Am I understood? Yes, sir, the teen quietly responded. Bakugo's tepid response shocked Izuku. He wasn't the only one, either, as several others in the room looked just as shocked. He saw that Ishido and even Kirishima were utterly floored. They were probably expecting Bakugo to defiantly bite back or at least have some kind of weight to his answer. Izuku would be lying if he said that he wasn't expecting that, too. He did notice the way that Gyro subtly perked up at the mention of Verdant, though. Good. Now, we're moving on to something that will decide the course of your careers here at UA, Aizawa began. And the entire class was on the edge of their seats in anticipation for what sort of earth-shattering task was ahead of them. You have to select a class rep. The room completely deflated like a wound, and the tension was replaced with mild indignation at the dramatic phrasing and genuine excitement for doing something relatively normal. Izuku listened to his class collectively attempt to decide how to go about selecting a representative for about half a second before his brain moved on to other things. Whatever shit he predicted that Bakugo would be in must have been rather severe for him to be so docile. It was pretty disconcerting, if he was being honest. There was also the thing with Todoroki. Prior to the battle trial, while the two-tone teen gave him somewhat contemptuous glares, they were often paired with searching glances, as if he was trying to decipher Izuku like a cryptogram. Today, however, the contempt was diluted in a storm of bitterness, a hint of resentment, and a heap of teenage angst. He wasn't quite sure what to make of that. His attention returned when a slip of paper was placed on his desk, and it occurred to him that they must have been voting for class rep. It was a strange way to go about it. He figured that most of the class would vote for themselves given that they all barely knew each other, so any winner would be whoever ended up with 2 or 3 votes total. He didn't really care one way or the other. He did have to take some time to decide who to vote for, though. His immediate thought was Ida, as he looked to be the most passionate about the position and would most definitely treat it the most seriously out of everyone there, himself included. However, that may be the exact issue. He was way too intense, and it could be intimidating for many. His next thought was Yaoyorozu, and he couldn't really find fault with that choice. She was exceptionally smart and probably the most responsible of the class. Even if she wasn't elected to be class rep, she'd almost certainly wind up being vice rep and still bring a ton of value to the role. He put a pin in it and moved on. Achako was bubbly as all hell, but she would be the first to admit that being class rep wasn't really her thing, and she'd probably punch him for voting for her. Shoji was cool, but he didn't think the taller boy would want the position given his demeanor. He was confident Toru could punch any issue presented to her, so she was an option. Takoyami. What a mad banquet of darkness, he heard the raven-headed boy muttering to himself. Izuku quickly moved on from that thought and wrote Yaoyorozu's name onto the OT before placing it in the box. When all the votes were cast, Ada went to the board to tally the results. Yaoyorozu's name received 3 tallies pretty early on, which he was expecting. He was not expecting to see his name receive a tally, but he wrote it off to being from Achako or Toru. Then he got another, but he wasn't particularly concerned. Then, he got a 3rd, and then he got a 4th. Pretty soon, he was up to 7. What the? Izuku absent-mindedly muttered. Language, Aizawa called out from his sleeping bag. At the end, Izuku led the pack with 15 votes. Yaoyorozu trailed in second place with 4, and Bakugo had a single vote. Izuku was rendered speechless, and he remained speechless even after Aizawa confirmed the decision, and the rest of the day proceeded on as normal. He was left to process that 3/4 of his class had chosen him to represent them. How the hell was he going to do that? Why had they even done that? Did they trust him? Why he felt that Yaoyorozu deserved the role so much more than he did? What was he even going to accomplish as class rep that she couldn't? Midoriya. He snapped out of the stupor that he was in for who knows how long to see the woman in question. Yaoyorozu, looking at him with mild concern. The classroom was mostly empty. The bell for lunch just rang. Are you well? She asked him. Oh, all right, yeah, I'm fine, he hastily assured. You go on ahead, I just have some things to think about. She nodded, albeit a bit reluctantly, and she left the room. Izuku sat at his desk for a few more moments before he stood and finally began meandering to the door. The second he stepped through the doorway, a hand clamped tightly on his right shoulder, and he was face to face with Todoroki. I didn't need your help, and I don't need or want any pity or concern from you, Todoroki spat before Izuku could say a word, and then he spun on his heel and stormed away. Where the hell did that come from? The hell is going on today? Izuku sat down with his food on one of the roofs of UA. He grabbed his food from the cafeteria and tried to slip out as inconspicuously as he could to an area with very few people. He had too much on his mind, from the revelation that he had already made a big enough impression on his classmates to Todoroki's confusing statement in the hallway. He was even thinking about what he told the reporters that morning and if it was the right decision to do so. He still hadn't truly figured out what kind of hero he wanted to be, and while he did want to help the people that just never had the support and opportunities that he was lucky enough to get, he also still didn't think he'd live up to the expectations that would come with that. He was pulled from his musing when he received a text from Yui. I saw you leave the cafeteria after you got your food. I think I know where you are. The roof, right? Do you mind if I eat with you? I don't mind at all. He was about to return to his food until his phone vibrated again. He should have remembered her ridiculous texting speed. A friend of mine from class is tagging along. Is that okay? That's fine. See you in a bit. He was about to return to his food again, but something she said occurred to him. How do you know I'm on the roof? Because eating on the roof to clear your head is incredibly cliché. Okay, ouch. Am I wrong? He begrudgingly conceded the point and bitterly tore into his lunch, waiting for his friend and her Plusone to arrive. After a few minutes, the door opened, and out stepped Yui with her usual stoic expression. Bounding out behind her was a girl with long, green hair, and she sported a smile full of pointed teeth. She looked him up and down for a few seconds before shooting him a flirtatious wink, and she could only sigh in both disappointment and amusement when he maintained his blank expression. Setsuna Takage, Yui spoke up while motioning to the other girl, and then she motioned to him. Izuku Midoriya. Recognition flittered in Takage's eyes, and she became incredulous. So this is the filthy heathen that claims All Might could go toe-to-toe with Godzilla. Oh my shit, Izuku heaved a sigh. All Might has literally changed the weather with a single punch, and that was years after his heyday. Godzilla doesn't have the feats or durability to compete with an All Might that isn't worried about collateral damage. Are you kidding me? Godzilla doesn't have the feats. Are you seriously trying to power scale Godzilla with me right now because you are not ready for that battle? Meanwhile, Yui was ignoring the two and watching the scene at the gates of the school. The press was still there trying to find a way inside, but something else grabbed her attention. She hummed to herself aloud, catching the notice of Izuku, who was preparing a rebuttal to Takage's use of charts, graphs, and a whiteboard filled with calculations to quantify the lacking strength of a full-powered United States of smash against Godzilla's atomic breath. What's up, Yui? He asked. Over there, she simply said, pointing to the ruckus at the gate. You mean the press is still out there? Takage complained with a bit of frustration. Not them, further down, she clarified. There's someone in a hoodie. The other two looked to where she was pointing to, and they saw the lone figure place his hand on the gate, and the three's eyes all went wide when that section of the gate disintegrated into a pile of dust. He took a step back and waited for the press to notice the new opening, and when they did, they stampeded inside, giving him the cover necessary to slip in with them. You guys saw that too, right? Takage worriedly asked. Came a more distressed than usual hum from Yui. Yeah, I did, Izuku confirmed with narrowed eyes. He scanned the crowd to find the intruder with the hoodie, but he was interrupted by the alarm going off campus-wide. This is bad, Takage remarked, now more serious than she was mere seconds before. You trying to find that guy? Yeah, Izuku responded. I think I lost him, though. Allow me, was her simple reply before one of her eyes split from her head and flew down to the stampede of reporters. Izuku kept himself from internally fanboying at how cool her quirk was, and he and Yui waited intently for her to find something. Takage's eye was scouring the mob for anyone who looked like they didn't belong, and she eventually found her target split off from the pack and step away from view. When a purple portal opened in front of him, she immediately launched her eye after him to not lose him. But he had apparently sensed he was being watched, and he turned around and grabbed the eye, decaying it to nothing but dust just as he did to the gate. Shit, Takage swore, he spotted me. Where is he? Izuku questioned. He stepped through a portal or warp gate or something. I didn't get to follow him in, but I caught a glimpse of familiar hallways, so he's definitely in the building. Do we go after him? Yui asked. I don't see why not, Takage replied. We need to at least warn a teacher. Already covered, Izuku spoke up after texting his mom and Nezu about the intruder. Let's find that motherer. And, with a toothy grin from Takage, the three bounded through the entrance to the roof and set off back into the building with Nezu's office as their first stop, as that was where Izuku knew the most sensitive information to be. Reaching the office and not finding anyone inside, the three looked around for any signs of the intruder potentially having already been there. Izuku, specifically, was running over every inch of the office with a fine-toothed comb to find anything out of place whatsoever. Seeing nothing, the three left and continued down the hall to the nearest teacher's lounge. Along the way, Izuku caught a glimpse of pale blue through the small window of a door on his left. Stopping on a dime, he turned to the door and looked through the window to see the hooded man picking up and reading through a small stack of papers. Activating his quirk and lighting up in a flash of yellow, Izuku pushed the door open and launched himself at the man. Time seemed to slow down for even himself as the man was about to step through another portal but instinctively launched his hand out towards Izuku. Izuku had already seen what the intruder could do with a touch, and he had no interest in becoming dust in the wind. Just before the man's fingers could brush against his, Izuku pivoted and dashed to the side to remain clear of his touch. It was all the man needed to leave through the portal, however, and the two locked eyes for a brief moment before the portal closed. "God damn it," he lamented. "Yo, Midoriya, you in here?" he heard Takage call out before the other two entered the room with him. Yui saw the consternation on Izuku's face, and she frowned. "What happened?" "I had him," he sighed. "He slipped right through my fingertips." "You caught him?" Takage questioned. "No, I'm pretty sure he was expecting me or anyone else to find him because he shot his hand out at me the second I entered the room," he explained. "I dodged to avoid ending up like your eye, and he escaped through another portal." "Did your eye grow back, by the way?" "Yeah, I can detach my limbs and control them telepathically, and they grow back if they're destroyed or if I lose connection with them," she explained with a toothy grin. "That is so cool," Izuku muttered, and he stopped himself before he could launch into a mutter spree. "I know I'm quite the catch, aren't I?" she teased with a pose. "Despite your Godzilla takes." Izuku muttered just loud enough for the two women to hear. "Oh, don't you start," Takage growled while Yui silently laughed at the interplay. "Let's ditch this place before anyone finds out that we practically went vigilante." Izuku's eyes went wide, and he quickly acquiesced. He hadn't actually considered that the teachers very likely would not want him or any students actively pursuing the intruder. "What, you didn't consider that when you suggested we," and I quote, "find that mother," or Takage pressed with a laugh. "Hell, I'm surprised that even Yui went along with it. You didn't strike me as a rule bender. Doing stupid things for the right reasons is the essence of being a hero, isn't it?" Yui shrugged. "You're goddamn right it is," Takage cheered. "I was fortunate enough to have people in my corner to help me achieve my dream, quirk or not. That support was the driving force that allowed me to get to this point, even before I eventually developed my quirk. Unfortunately, not everyone is a late bloomer, and even less people have that kind of support behind them. That's an issue, and either not enough heroes make an effort to address it, or their efforts aren't publicized and just end up falling on deaf ears. And you want to be that hero, you want to be a symbol for the public, similar to All Might. No, not like All Might. I could never live up to that, and, frankly, I feel like my efforts would be much better served trying to help those that not even All Might could reach. Even with a pillar propping up society, people still slip through the cracks. Someone has to be there to extend a helping hand out from the darkness and into the light. So a symbol for the disenfranchised, then. If that's the easiest way to phrase it, then sure." In a dark room nestled within an abandoned apartment sat a noseless man watching the impromptu interview of a UA student very intently. His narrow, red-eyed gaze studied every detail of the video, committing the face of the green-haired teen to memory. "Interesting," he mused aloud. "Not All Might, but being there for those that even All Might missed. Very interesting." He sat up, grabbing the bandages that he typically wrapped around his arms and over his eyes. "Should we meet one day, I'll test that conviction of yours." After applying the bandages, he grabbed a long, tattered, red scarf beside a freshly edged katana. "And if your conviction doesn't measure up, you'll be purged like the rest of the fakes. So a symbol for the disenfranchised, then. If that's the easiest way to phrase it, then sure." A scoff could be heard from a man with black, unruly hair with a horribly burned body covered in a myriad of patchwork skin grafts and staples. "Yeah, whatever," he spat before putting his phone away. "You'll burn with the rest. If that's the easiest way to phrase it, then sure." "What a disgrace. A young, pure human only turned out to just be more diseased filth," growled a man wearing a stylized plague doctor mask. While he was seething, a little girl huddled in the corner of the room ran some of the things the teen said back in her mind. She didn't understand a lot of it, the words were really big and they talked so fast, but she did understand one key point. A hero for the people even All Might couldn't reach, the people that slipped through the cracks. She didn't know who All Might was, but she was pretty small. Maybe she slipped through a crack and didn't remember, maybe she slipped through a crack, and that was why she made her dad disappear. Maybe that was why she was cursed. Did she deserve to be saved? She was cursed and a monster, so did she really deserve for a hero to come rescue her from the crack she slipped through? She really hoped so. "Iri, get in the chair." Tamura was as still as a statue in his seat at the bar. Kurogiri had taken to wiping glasses that had long since been cleaned as Tamura sat in silence after watching the video from Shueisha. "Tamura, is something the matter?" called a voice from a monitor. Both Tamura and Kurogiri were at attention at the sound. "No," the young man responded with a voice almost as dry as his skin. "The plan is still good to go. The symbol of peace will die." He paused for a moment, considering his words before speaking. "That boy, though, something about him. There was something vaguely familiar about him. But I could not place it. I will look into it another time, but for now, focus on your current mission of disposing of the symbol of peace, the voice calmly instructed. Tamura looked back at the small screen of his phone, and his thoughts returned to the green-haired teenager. You're the same brat that almost caught me. A hero for those who fell through the cracks, huh? A curious glint appeared in the man's red eyes. Survive tomorrow, and we'll see about that, hero brat. As class rep, Izuku was given the task of herding his classmates to the bus and ensuring that everyone was present and accounted for before they left campus. It was time for their first field trip of sorts. They were doing rescue training at a special facility off campus, and it went without saying that the class was absolutely pumped. From getting the chance to shine in their preferred domain to finally getting the opportunity to perform in their field of choice, everyone was hyped for one reason or another. Well, almost everyone. Mr. Aizawa, where's Bakugo? Mina questioned before they boarded the bus. Bakugo won't be participating in heroics lessons until after the sports festival as part of his punishment for his stunt earlier this week, he plainly responded. Any other questions? When no one responded, he climbed into his sleeping bag and hopped onto the bus, signaling for his class to follow his lead. They boarded and set off for their first rescue training. Izuku found himself sitting between Asui and Kirishima as his class made casual conversation amongst each other. He spent that time silently listening to them interact while still sorting some things out in his mind. He felt his phone vibrate, and he saw that he received a text from Yui. She had sent him a picture of herself in her hero costume, as it was the first time she got to wear it since school was cancelled early the day prior. Are you going for Ultraman, Super Sentai, or Pokémon Trainer? He waited a few moments for a response. It was longer than she'd usually take to type up a message, so he figured she was really considering the question. A little of all three, I suppose. Ultraman more than anything. Thank you for noticing. Midoriya, Asui called out to him. Swiftly putting his phone away, he turned to acknowledge the frog girl beside him. I usually say what's on my mind, so I'm sorry in advance if I offend you, she began. No worries, Asui, I appreciate bluntness, he assured. And he did. Yui was incredibly straightforward with him most of the time, even if it meant incidentally roasting his choice of venue for clearing his head. Call me Tsu, she insisted. Oh, alright, Izuku stumbled. You can call me Izuku, then. It wouldn't really be fair for you to have to call me by my surname all the time. She happily croaked at that, and that warmed Izuku's heart. Unbeknownst to him, Mina was shooting a knowing smirk to Achako, who was pointedly looking out of the window. And he wonders why we voted for him, Kaminari joked, causing those around them to laugh along with him and Izuku's eye to twitch at the reminder. Anyway, Tsu continued after composing herself, your quirk is bullshit. And the easy, lighthearted laughter became choked, shocked guffaws. Asui, you cannot just insult someone's quirk like that, Ida quickly reprimanded. She's not wrong, Izuku responded with a shrug. My quirk is so ridiculous that my mom and I researched what would cause something so seemingly convoluted to manifest in someone, especially so late. That's right, you were a late bloomer, Sato spoke up from beside Tsu. I saw that interview last night from one of those reporters outside of the school building. Same, Mina excitedly joined in. We got to peel back the curtain into the life of our class rep. You already have a cool origin story. What did that research turn up? Tsu asked him. Nothing conclusive, we inevitably just chalked it up to quirk science being really weird and my quirk being a massive expression of all of the quirk factors in my family tree, Izuku answered. Something that did pop up more than once, though, was quirk singularity theory. What's that? Kirishima asked from beside him, his attention completely held by Izuku in that moment. A quick look around showed that just about everyone else was in the same boat. In short, it's this theory developed by a guy named Dr. Kyudai Garaki, Izuku began, missing the near imperceptible flinch from Aoyama sitting across from him. According to which, as generations pass, quirks become stronger, more complex, and much more difficult to control. He theorized that, eventually, quirks across the globe would become way too overpowered for us to manage because we wouldn't evolve quickly enough to deal with them. He was called a crackpot at the time, and the theory is still seen as crackpot nowadays, but it's an interesting idea to think about. The class was left in silence at the information. Despite the doomsday nature of the theory, it wasn't entirely unfounded, especially in that day and age. There were many plain destructive quirks out there that their wielders just had trouble controlling. Maybe that's why my younger sister has trouble controlling the mucus she secretes, Tsu mused with a finger on her chin. Mine only stings a little bit, but hers can really do damage if she isn't careful. Come to think of it, my little cousin can turn his skin into diamond. But it's hard for him to move when he does, Kirishima pondered. Even so, my quirk isn't nearly as flashy as his or even yours, Midori bro. Don't sell yourself short, Izuku countered. So, you're not a walking, talking rainbow. One who is almost as sparkly as moi, Aoyama cut in with. Well, Izuku figured it was an attempt at a compliment, but he couldn't be sure. A sparkly, walking, talking rainbow, Izuku amended. Your quirk allows you to make your skin about as hard as steel, right? More or less, Kirishima answered. Then you're already a walking, talking juggernaut in combat and in rescue. Just keep getting harder, and you'll be fine, Izuku casually encouraged. There was a brief silence after that, and then there was a snicker. That snicker snowed into scattered laughs, and those laughs snowed even further into the class, erupting into laughter, with the exception of Izuku, who maintained his blank expression. Aizawa sighed at the front of the bus. He wasn't entirely convinced that his student didn't know exactly what he was doing and wasn't using his lack of a social life growing up as plausible deniability. Why couldn't he have a normal class for once? You wanted to see me, Sir Toshinori asked when he stepped into Nezu's office. He was surprised to find Verdant already inside. Indeed, have a seat, the chimera chirped. Toshinori did as instructed and surveyed the scene. Nezu was staring at him with a smile that something within him told him was nefarious. Verdant, on the other hand, was unreadable. He couldn't gauge exactly what that blank yet penetrating stare was about, but it didn't make him feel any less uncomfortable. What's this about? The blonde hesitantly asked his boss. It has come to my attention that you wish to take my protege from me, Nezu answered while maintaining his smile. I don't understand, Toshinori said in confusion. You've been stalking my son, he heard Verdant finally speak up, to which he coughed up a considerable amount of. And no, it's not what you think, Mrs. Midoriya. He hurriedly tried to placate her and kill her suspicions. I wasn't stalking him, he just. You believe he's the perfect candidate to be your successor, Nezu finished for him. At his alarmed expression, Nezu continued without missing a beat. Verdant is one of my most trusted comrades, and since this directly involves her son, she was going to be privy to it eventually. Toshinori had to concede that point. The staff was already aware of his condition and time limit, so he didn't have to hide the fact that he was All Might, but they were not aware of the nature of his quirk and the history, obligations that came with it. He supposed that if he was scoping out Verdant's son, she indeed had the right to know. He sighed, and then he spoke. Well, the truth about my quirk is that it is inheritable. My quirk is called One for All, and it has the ability to be passed down from user to user if the current wielder wishes it so. As you can probably already tell, my time as the symbol of peace is slowly coming to an end thanks to the injury I sustained, so I've been in search of a successor to pass the quirk onto, and trained to take up the mantle when I'm no longer around. His eyes filled with intensity and conviction. I truly believe that your son is the next wielder of One for All and will take up the mantle as the next symbol of peace. Verdant and Nezu were silent. He didn't know if they were considering everything he had said or if they secretly had a telepathic link and were communicating with each other outside of his notice. Does he? Verdant asked with a raised eyebrow. I don't know what you mean, Toshinori replied. I haven't approached him about it yet, if that's what you're asking. She stifled a chuckle, and the blonde man grew even more confused. I can't make decisions for him, especially not one like this, but I think he's already made the decision for himself. Now, Toshinori was totally perplexed. Nezu took pity on him and pushed a tablet across his desk toward him, and he picked it up and played the video that was waiting for him. What he watched was young Midoriya having a pseudo-interview with a woman with light blue skin and lilac hair. The boy talked about his time believing he was quirkless and spending much of that in an indoctrination zone. He talked about how it affected his outlook on heroics and what it drove him to accomplish. And finally, he talked about how he didn't want to be a successor of sorts to All Might in favor of being a beacon for those who fell through the cracks of society that not even All Might was able to reach. Oh, was all the current symbol of peace could say in response. Oh, indeed, Nezu cackled in glee. You will not be poaching my protege today. I suppose not, he responded with a downcast sigh. Even if you can't have him, at least this just narrows it down for your other candidates. Verdant tried to console a warm smile. You do have other candidates, right? Well, Toshinori choked. Good grief, Yagi, Verdant groaned. I do have a few other first-year students in mind, as well as the third year that Murai has been campaigning for, but I was certain that young Midoriya was the one. Well, please select one soon, Nezu spoke up. You should be at the USJ right now, but you used up too much of your time limit this morning. Speaking of, Verdant began, turning to Nezu, are you certain that it's a good idea to send them to the USJ after the incident yesterday? I have not been able to determine if the intruder took anything before they escaped. If Izuku's warning was to be believed, then they had an accomplice with a warping ability. They more than likely went directly to a room without cameras and left just as quickly, Nezu surmised. However, the USJ's distress signal is instantaneous and now has remote viewing thanks to Izuku's suggestion. We will know immediately if something is amiss, and we will be able to determine the situation long before we arrive. She nodded, even though the blonde could tell very easily that she wasn't entirely sold. It appeared that their business in the office had concluded, so Yagi took the opportunity to confirm or deny the suspicions he had. Excuse me, Mrs. Midoriya, call me Inko. I killed my husband. Toshinori was at a loss for words. There was absolutely nothing at his disposal to respond to that statement, which the woman had said so casually and matter-of-factly. He looked to Nezu, and the animal of indeterminable origin only maintained his trademark smile. He was obviously aware of it happening. Do I even want to know why he finally spoke? He was threatening Izuku's life, she answered just as calmly. He was also probably a terrorist. Toshinori was still unable to formulate a response to that new bit of information, but he swore he heard a faint shout of, "That's my girl," in the back of his mind. Anyway, Toshinori coughed out with a glob of in a desperate attempt to move on. What's your maiden name, if I may ask? She hummed, as if considering the question. That depends. Technically, it's Akatani, as that was the name of my adoptive family. My birth surname is Shimura, but I haven't gone by that since I was 4. Why do you ask? Toshinori fought back a gasp. He needed to know for sure. Was your mother's name, perhaps, Nana Shimura? Yes, if I'm not mistaken, she answered with a critical eye. You're most certainly not my father if that's where this is headed. The amount of that Toshinori hacked up after that comment was probably a new record for him. He didn't get the chance to respond, however, as the door bust open, and a frantic Tenya Ida threw himself inside. The USJ is under attack by villains, he shouted. Earlier on, Class 1A arrived at the USJ. Getting off the bus and heading inside, they were transfixed by the sheer size of the building. Many of them likened it to a massive amusement park with several radically different areas, each one being massive in their own rights. Welcome to my own personal playground, the unforeseen simulation joint called a voice from behind the class, causing them to turn around and inspect the new arrival wearing a spacesuit-inspired costume. Oh my god, it's 13, Ochako shouted, practically floating in utter glee. Izuku smiled at his friend's antics that reminded him of how he would have reacted to seeing All Might in the flesh years prior. Speaking of All Might, he was supposed to be there with them, but he was nowhere to be seen. Izuku watched 13 quietly speak with an irritated-looking Aizawa, and she put up 3 fingers. He didn't know what that meant, but he had an inkling that it had to do with All Might's absence. Maybe All Might would get there in 3 hours. He was Japan's #1, so it wouldn't be out of the realm of possibility for him to have been preoccupied with something. However, if that were the case, Aizawa would have been aware of it beforehand, so it must have been a last-minute development. That was odd, but it would explain why neither Aizawa or any of the class was informed. Izuku caught the encroaching hand of Ochako beside him, much to her annoyance. Even when you're not paying attention, you're still paying attention. How does that even work? Ochako huffed in a whisper. Train with my mom for a few days and you'll understand. Izuku chuckled. What did I miss? She's talking about how dangerous our quirks can be when used to attack, so we're gonna be using them to save lives today, she answered. Hey, what's that over by the fountain? Kirishima pointed out. Everyone turned to see what he was talking about, and a purple blob manifested from nothing in mid-air. The blob expanded, and Izuku's went cold. Shit, he lowly muttered, and only Ochako heard him. What's that? She asked him, worry edging into her tone. The intruder from yesterday, he answered while his body became tense. I saw him while I was on the roof during lunch. Are those villains part of the exercise? Mr. Aizawa, Kirishima asked. No, this isn't part of the class. Those villains are real, he gravely answered. Everyone's faces fell in dismay, and panic and worry began to overtake the students. Kaminari, can you radio to anyone on campus for help? Aizawa asked. I've been trying, but I can't reach anyone, he answered. They must have someone jamming the area with a quirk, Todoroki mused. So that must mean the distress signal hasn't alerted Nezu, and all of our phones are on the bus. Great, Izuku thought to himself with a scowl. His eyes were planted on the purple warp gate where tons of villains were spilling out behind a man with hands all over his body. Next to him was a hulking creature with black, scarred skin, an exposed brain, and a beak-like mouth full of jagged teeth. The sight of the humanoid made him shiver, as it was clearly the poster child for human experimentation. The man covered in hands, however, unsettled him even more. Izuku recognized that pale hair, and, for a brief moment, the two met each other's gazes once again. 13. Protect the students, Aizawa said before putting on his goggles. You're not seriously going to go down there on your own, are you? Izuku asked him in concern. Your mother would, Aizawa answered simply. Izuku wasn't expecting that answer, but he wouldn't be deterred so easily. With all due respect, sir, I've seen my mother do some truly ridiculous shit in training. You are not her. And, as good as you are, neither are you, so stay put, Aizawa responded with finality. Besides, even if I'm not as good as Verdant, I do know a thing or two. With that, he leaped down the stairs and toward the central plaza to meet the thugs head-on. Izuku was remiss to not do anything at first, but that feeling evaporated when he watched his teacher mow through the thugs with frightening competence. He supposed that it shouldn't have surprised him, as the man's quirk only put villains at a level playing field with him, so he had to be superior to his opponent in hand-to-hand combat, by necessity. The scant videos of Eraserhead online that he had seen only confirmed that. He had other things to worry about, though. The purple warp gate villain had left the intruder and the beaked abomination in the central plaza where they merely stood and surveyed the scene. Meanwhile, said warp villain appeared at the entrance before them. Good afternoon, the voice began in smooth baritone. We are the League of Villains. We are here to kill All Might, but it appears that our information was incorrect since All Might is not present. They're here to kill All Might. I don't know whether to be relieved or on edge that he isn't here, Izuku thought. Stay behind me, 13 shouted before preparing to activate her quirk. But Kirishima leaped forward regardless to attack the Misty Marauder. It proved to be pointless, as the villain simply moved away from the attack and proceeded with his job of scattering the students. Izuku found himself falling through a portal and plummeting to a body of water. He braced for impact and slammed through the surface of the water, and he reoriented himself in time to see a shark villain swimming toward him with malicious intent. The shock of seeing him caused Izuku to heat up, and the water around him quickly took on a red glow. Before he realized what he did, the villain stopped his advance and backpedaled from him, and Izuku felt a tongue wrap around his waist and yank him out of the water. He looked up to see Tsu carrying him with her face in a pained grimace. Once he was deposited onto the deck of a ship, she quickly receded her tongue and croaked in pain, and Izuku only looked at her and back at the steaming patch of water he was just in to put 2 and 2 together. Before he could say something, she hopped back into the water and swam below the surface. Izuku didn't understand why she returned to clear danger until she resurfaced, and violently dropped Minda onto the deck of the ship. "Tsu, your tongue," he fretted. "It's okay, Izuku," she tried to assure. "The pain isn't debilitating, and it'll heal eventually." "No, it's not okay. My quirk scalded you when you rescued me, let me help," Izuku maintained with his hand emitting a pink glow. The hand then erupted into pink flames that caught the attention of both Tsu and Minda. "What the heck is that?" the diminutive boy asked while on a break from freaking out. "It's part of my quirk, pink heals damage." "Show me your tongue," he instructed, and she obliged, allowing him to apply the soft, pink fire onto her burns. The two watched in silent amazement as the rosy fire did away with the damage in short order, and Tsu moved her tongue around after he finished with a growing feeling of joy. The look of total reverence in Minda's eyes returned, and Izuku realized that he probably shouldn't keep putting off finding out exactly what that was, but it would have to wait. "Now that that's taken care of, we have to deal with them," he said while pointing a thumb at the villains in the water. Meanwhile, the villains in the water were watching the scene with trepidation. "I don't like this," the Sharkman said. "That kid looks like his quirk heals people, but he damn near boiled the water we were in just now. It would have cooked me alive if I attacked him." "We have no idea what they can do," another villain added. "You say that kid can heal, how?" a third villain asked. "Healing quirks are super rare, and we could always use a healer, or even pimp him out to others. I think we should take him alive and kill the other two." "Okay, what the hell is your fascination with kidnapping children?" the second villain asked. "This is the 4th child you've wanted to take this week. Are you saying we shouldn't make off with the super rare healer kid who just might have more than one quirk?" he retorted. "It's the principle of the matter," the second villain shot back. "You have made wanting to take kids a habit regardless of how valuable they might be to you. Will you two shits please shut the hell up and focus on the goddamn job?" For once the shark villain cut in, before he looked up at the ship and saw that the 3 teens had vanished. "What the serious? Where did they go?" "What do you mean weren't you watching them?" the second villain pressed. "I can't focus when you, Tweedle dipshit, and you," he pointed at the third villain, Tweedle dumbass, "are arguing about the color of the sky on a daily basis." The other two were begrudgingly silent, knowing that their partner wasn't exactly wrong. "I'm taking the kid," the third villain spoke up. "This is pointless," a fourth villain finally growled before using his quirk to form a giant hand out of water, and he violently attacked the ship, splitting it in half so that it would sink. Back on said ship, the 3 had just finished explaining their quirks to each other and were trying to develop a game plan before the ship was attacked and split down the middle. Or, more accurately, Izuku and Tsu were formulating a plan of action while Minda freaked out over the situation. The attack on the ship only furthered his spiral, and he was in a full-on doomsday panic. "We're going to die, we're going to die, we're going to die. I can't believe I won't ever get to touch Yaoyorozu's s. It's no use. We can't fight them and they're going to kill All Might after killing us and I'll never actually be cool." And he was smacked out of his spiral by a literal smack from Izuku. "Calm down, Minda," Izuku commanded before looking the shorter boy in the eye. "We're training to be heroes. This is what heroes do. They're faced with impossible odds, and they find ways to pull through. They meet danger head-on, and they punch danger in the throat not only to protect themselves, but to ensure the safety of everyone around them. I helped you in the entrance exam, and then we helped each other. Do not make me regret that." His gaze became a picture of steely determination. "Instead, let's get out there and show those asshats that they don't get to with Minoruing Minta, Tsuyuing Asui, and Izukuing Midoriya without paying for it out of their own assholes." Mina was wide-eyed for the bulk of Izuku's pep talk, but his own gaze steeled with the same determination that Izuku was imparting onto the both of them. "What do you need me to do?" Izuku smirked. "Same strat we pulled against the robots on my signal. Tsu," he addressed her, "get ready to haul ass out of here with us when I give the word." "Ribbit." Izuku nodded and kneeled down, and Minda hopped onto his. Izuku went up in green flames that bathed the both of the boys. "So, as long as I'm not touching water, my quirk still functions just fine. How the hell am I not burning?" Izuku leaped into the air, all the while pulling the green fire into his right hand. He was specifically sending it to his middle finger and thumb. "This is going to be very unpleasant," he internally whined before snapping his finger forward with all of the added force that his green fire allowed. The resulting sonic boom and accompanying cry of sent an extremely powerful gust of wind at the villains surrounding the sinking ship. The wind pierced through the surface of the water and created a whirlpool that sucked the villains within its clutches, unable to escape. "Let it rip," he shouted to his momentary partner, and Mina did not hesitate to throw scores of sticky S at them. The onslaught of S circled the whirlpool along with the villains and practically glued them together, trapping them in the water. Izuku shifted Minda off his back and held onto him with his left arm before looking back at their third comrade on the ship. Sui shouted, and the affirmative croak he received was followed by her tongue wrapping around his waist, and the three left the shipwreck in style. The impromptu team landed near the water's edge, and they surveyed the scene for the first time since being warped away. What they saw wasn't pretty. There were low-level thugs and villains strewn about in various states of consciousness, and in the center of it all was a beaten and Aizawa under the gargantuan fist of the nightmarish science experiment. The three held back gasps to avoid detection, but they knew from the maniacal cackling of the apparent ringleader that the situation was bad. Izuku quietly healed his beyond broken middle finger in case they needed to jump in for an immediate rescue of their teacher. At that moment, the warped villain appeared beside the ringleader. Tamura Shigaraki, the misty man, acknowledged. "Kurogiri, did you kill 13 and the brats?" the man asked in his voice that was in dire need of a lotion smoothie. 13 is out of commission, but I must regretfully inform you that one of the students escaped, he responded in his deep monotone. No, the man whined. That's game over. All Might isn't even here and the brat is just gonna bring help. This whole trip has been a bust. Tamura turned a wicked eye to the three teens at the water's edge. His eyes lit up when he saw the special hero brat that caught his attention. Well, maybe it wasn't a total bust. Killing a couple of his precious students when he wasn't here to protect them will hit him where it really hurts. He lunged for the three students much faster than he had any right to be, with his hand outstretched to turn an unlucky teenager to dust. He was heading right for Izuku, as he had already proven himself to be a threat, and killing the student who publicly sought to help the downtrodden and the forgotten would make the League of Villains infamous. Whether or not that infamy would be the right kind was irrelevant to Tamura. It would hurt All Might on a significant level, so he would do it. Izuku, on the other hand, had no plans of being reduced to dust that day, and yellow embers sparked in his hair to signify his preparation to dodge. However, he did not account for a pair of strong feet knocking him out of the path of the villain, causing the villain to slightly change course and go after the culprit, Sue. Tamura reached her and palmed her face with the intention of dusting her for saving his prey from him, and Izuku's heart sank to the pits of his stomach. Fortunately for the teens, nothing happened, and Tamura was left momentarily perplexed and staring into the steely determination in the eyes of the resolute frog girl. Then, it hit him. "You're so cool, Ira." Literally. Izuku, bright as the sun, slammed a fist into the face of Tamura faster than the Namu could react, knocking the hand covering his face onto the ground and sending Tamura sprawling next to it. The Namu was on him in less than a second and backhanded the boy away from its master. Sue and Mina scrambled to Izuku's side to ensure he was okay. No. Father, there you are. Father, you're still here," Tamura rambled in hysterics. Upon placing the hand back onto his face, he growled in absolute hatred. "Namu, kill him." The Namu zoomed toward the trio with a raised fist primed to turn Izuku and company into paste. Izuku only had a split second to hook the two by their arms and practically flash away as quickly as he could. Depositing the two onto the ground, he flashed away again, knowing that clearing the 15 meters he pushed himself to cover would be nothing to the Namu. He was proven right when the Namu was on him again, and he wasn't fast enough to avoid the punch that came right for his ribs. He both heard and felt the snaps as the blow sent him careening into the nearest wall. The impact momentarily took him away from the searing pain he was feeling and the almost glowing yellow eyes that were watching him carefully from the shadows. But when his wits returned, he watched in horror as Sue and Minta attempted to hamper the Namu's advance toward him. Minta's S were ineffective in slowing it down, and it caught Sue out of the air before she could make it to him. The violent snapping of her arm and her pained wails rang like a death knell in his ears and shocked him into motion. He practically flew toward them like a golden missile and kicked the Namu in the beak as hard as he could, slightly knocking it off kilter. And he immediately whipped off his cape and bounded the Namu's legs together with it, if only to keep it stationary for even just a moment. Yanking Sue from its grasp, he bounded away from the threat and carefully dropped her off next to a frantic Minta. Before he could say a word, the Namu grabbed him by the back of the head with some of the shreds of his cape around its ankles. Izuku was quite sick of its shit by that point, and he could feel the frightening spark of blackness return to him. That monster had hurt his teacher and his friends right in front of him as they tried to protect him, and he was not going to let anyone else get hurt as long as he was still breathing. Turning a snarl back toward the Namu, a bright inferno of green flames ignited onto his right arm, and only his right arm. He would have noticed the wisps of black fire intermingling with the green at spots, but he was completely focused on stopping the rampaging beast. Twisting his body around in its grasp, he launched a right hook at the Namu's exposed brain with the most force he could drag from within, and then some, and it connected, blasting the Namu away from him and his two friends upon impact. Tamura and Kurogiri were left wide-eyed at the display. The Namu was designed to be an unstoppable killing machine that could match All Might in its prime, and it would most certainly be able to take down the currently weakened All Might, let alone some pissant hero brat. But the kid had just landed a blow hard enough to literally blow the creature away. "Kurogiri, is that kid using ing hacks?" Tamura asked a bit indignantly. "I do not know, Tamura Shigaraki," Kurogiri replied. "What did I tell you about saying the whole name? It's weird." Just call me Tamura. My mistake, Tamura Shigaraki. You're doing this on purpose, aren't you? I have no idea what you're talking about, Tamura Shigaraki. If you weren't our ride home, I'd dust you right here. Tamura could have sworn he heard the Misty Man snicker. He didn't even know that he could snicker. Meanwhile, Izuku was on his knees in the worst pain of his life. He was in too much pain to notice the glowing yellow eyes slowly inch closer to his position. His arm was a color that he wasn't sure he had ever seen before in any capacity. The sickly fusion of purple and red skin cascading over the torn muscles and damn near shattered bones almost made him ugly cry. He gathered the energy he had left into his left hand, and pink flames ignited in his palm to heal his arm and mend his ribs. But something stopped him. It wasn't the Namu, it wasn't the incredulous rants of Tamura, and it wasn't his own pain. It wasn't even the malevolent figure creeping up on him. It was the soft croak that escaped Tsu's throat where she lay next to Mainta. Izuku stared at them. He stared at her arm that was snapped in two different places, flopping uselessly beside her. He stared down at his own useless arm and then back at her. Slowly, he dragged himself to the pair. Mainta couldn't even bring himself to speak at the sight of Izuku's mangled arm, and he sat in horrified silence as the green head made his way to them and hovered over Tsu. He extended his good arm, and pink flame bloomed around it before it shot out of his hand and enveloped Tsu. The girl croaked in surprise, and she almost instantly felt the pain vanish and her arm practically reset itself. She turned a witty-eyed stare to Izuku, and he only gave a reassuring half-smile before the pink flame died down and he nearly collapsed to the floor. Minder rushed to his side to check on him, but a gleeful cackle caught their attention. "Oh yes, what a display! You'll make a fine meat suit with a powerful quirk like that," came the call of a dark green mass of sludge that quickly knocked Minder away and enveloped Izuku. The alarmed teen just didn't have the energy to put up a fight as the sludge villain forced its way into his mouth and down his throat. Sheer panic flooded him when he felt the disgusting, viscous liquid squeeze into his windpipe, and Izuku reflexively activated his quirk. His panic triggered the red flames to blast both around him and within him, and Minda was only barely saved by Tsu yanking him away from the heat at the last moment and jumping away. The sludge villain was inundated with temperatures that he could have never even fathomed, and he ejected himself from the crimson teen with horrific wails of pain. He was both evaporating at an exponential rate and burning a sticky, repugnant mark into the ground. The terror in his yellow eyes was even off-putting to Tamura and Kirigiri, but they did not lift a finger to help. The sludge villain was left to his fate, soon overcome by the Crimson Inferno and succumbing to a fiery death in the central plaza of the USJ. The area that had just been serenaded by the pleading howls of pain of the sludge villain was now dead silent. No one said a word, not Tamura, neither Tsu nor Mainta, not Aizawa, and not the few students who had made their way to the bottom of the stairs. Izuku was stock-still, staring in horror at the steaming black gunk that used to be the sludge villain. "Holy shit." Tamura broke the silence. "That was ing metal. I didn't think the hero brats had it in them to kill." Izuku heard none of it as the enormity of what had just happened finally caught up to him. He had just practically vaporized someone. He had killed someone. With his quirk, he literally killed someone. He started to shake, and his breaths became shallow. The footsteps of Tamura started to echo loudly in his head, too loudly, much too loudly. His ears were ringing, and he was hyperventilating. "Brat, you really are something," Tamura continued before looking down at the teen. Izuku did not look up, and he did not hear him. "I think I'm gonna let you live to be the savior of the darkness or whatever the hell it was you spouted. You're an entertaining player too. Better than All Might, that's for sure." Izuku was far too wrapped up in a violent panic attack to even comprehend what was going on around him. But he was eventually given a break when his exhaustion caught up with him and his brain completely shut down, and he fell right into unconsciousness at Tamura's feet. "Brats all tuckered out," Tamura observed. "Oh well, let's start killing the rest." He was interrupted once again when an invisible fist slammed into his gut, practically folding him over, an invisible arm that unceremoniously dumped him onto his back. He didn't even get the chance to heave before an invisible foot stomped on his crotch, and he unleashed a shriek that made even the Namu wince. Speaking of the Namu, it was scrambling to determine what threat to protect its master from, as it couldn't see one. Toru heaved the unconscious form of Izuku over her shoulder and bolted away while Kirishima collected the shaken Tsu and Mainta. At that moment, the doors blew open, and all attention flocked to the two new arrivals. "Have no fear," a voice bellowed with an undertone of simmering rage. The students all immediately felt their spirits lift into the stratosphere, while the remaining thugs and villains started to shit themselves. "For I am here," All Might finished without his trademark smile, and that was frightening enough. The older villains, however, felt a double dose of terror. The few who had encountered the woman beside him were frozen in place at the all-too-familiar glare in her green eyes that was accompanied by an aura of unadulterated malice. That malice shot through the roof when her eyes landed on the form of her son, and a few of the thugs were strongly considering surrender. "All Might," Tamura breathed out. "You're finally here, now we can kill you." "Achako," Verdant sternly addressed without taking her eyes from the scene below. Report. Achako had been so completely floored by the sheer presence of All Might and Verdant that she almost jumped out of her skin when addressed. 13 was badly injured. WWE did the best we could to mitigate the damage, though. And Eraserhead. He's down there, but the big, black monster hurt him really badly. It hurt Izuku and Sue, too, she about choked out. If Verdant's fury could grow any further, it would have been visible around her. All Might, take the big one. It looks like it was made with you in mind. I'll handle the rest. Are you sure? I wasn't asking. And, like a bullet, Verdant shot down the stairs and into a group of sweating thugs, launching into a flurry of brutal punches, knees, and elbows. She kicked one in the face and pivoted with her other foot to intercept a man with a pipe coming from behind, taking the pipe from him and breaking his arm in one swift motion. A strike with the pipe to his knee disabled him before she met her next attacker's blade with the pipe. Another came from behind again to overwhelm her, but she ducked the attack and watched him unwitting hit the other in the face with a fist covered in bone plating. She took that opportunity to sweep both of their legs and bash them both into unconsciousness with the pipe. She popped back to her feet in time to see two new threats rushing at her from opposite sides with blunt weapons in hand, so she snatched them out of their respective grasps with her quirk, and she simultaneously launched them at the opposing thugs' heads with two satisfying thunks following. Ochako, watching all of this from the top of the stairs, was positively blown away. She figured that Izuku's mom was strong, but what she was seeing was on another level. It wasn't necessarily without comparison, but she was mowing through the numbers of remaining villains with such ease and ferocity without having a big, bombastic quirk that it inspired a well of hope in her that she could be something similar. That woman offered to train me, she remembered with eyes the size of dinner plates. You go, Mrs. Midoriya. Wait, Midoriya, Mina asked beside her. As in our class rep, Midoriya. Ochako nodded. That's his mom. She works at UA. That's Midoriyas mom, came the simultaneous shouts of Mina, Siro, Shoji, and Sato as they watched Verdant yoink a villain's hard hat with her quirk and proceed to smack him across the face with it. Eventually, Verdant cleaved through the thugs that attempted to stand their ground until she was beside Aizawa and face to face with Tamura. You alive, kid? She asked the wide homeroom teacher. Yeah, I'm good, he responded with a cough, appreciating the attempt at dry levity given the situation. Good, she replied. This the guy who dusted the gate with a touch? Yeah, that's him, Aizawa answered. Keep him in my line of sight. Roger, she said, already understanding the plan. Tamura, meanwhile, was confused and a little annoyed at the new arrival that was threatening to ruin his viewing of Namu killing All Might. Who the hell are you? It won't matter in a few minutes, Verdant coldly responded and cracked her knuckles. Tamura didn't even get the chance to sneer out a reply before she decked him in the face, knocking off the hand covering it a second time, and drove a powerful knee into his abdomen. He forewent, catching his breath in favor of grabbing onto her to turn her to dust, but nothing happened. His eyes went wide again. Got him it, eraser. He was cut off again when Verdant grabbed his arm and jerked his elbow in the opposite direction. He didn't get the chance to scream for Namu to help before she slammed him onto his back and unloaded all of her fury onto his face, one haymaker at a time. The Namu couldn't help even if it wanted to, as it was preoccupied with getting pounded into the fifth dimension by All Might. Tsurajiri tried to intervene, but an unexpected glacier slammed into him, and he was tackled by his metal collar by a returning Kirishima. Tamura was hanging onto consciousness by a thread when Verdant stepped away from him, and two things happened. All Might blasted the Namu through the ceiling of the USJ, and Eraserhead momentarily took his eyes off of him to see what All Might had just done. Tamura poured all of his energy into a single move to get back at the miserable ing that broke his arm, nose, and what he suspected was his orbital bone. He launched at her from the ground, intent on turning her to dust with his one good hand, but a glacier slammed into him from his right side and knocked him away. Verdant and Aizawa looked over to where the ice originated from, and they saw Todoroki looking at Verdant with an unreadable expression. Then, he turned away, muttering "we're even," lowly enough that Verdant and Aizawa almost didn't catch it. An angry, childish shriek brought their attention back to the pale man. No fair, knowing fair, Tamura whined in his tantrum. All Might hasn't gotten weaker at all, and this comes out of nowhere. You're not even supposed to be here. Who wrote you into this shitty campaign? Verdant quirked an amused eyebrow at the scene. Somewhere along the line, however, Kirigiri managed to get free, and he manifested as a portal below Tamura so that the two could make their escape. A second later, the door burst open once again. I have returned with reinforcements, Ida shouted then. He took in the scene, and his excitement fell flat. Are we late? Nezu sheepishly asked. Just barely, Ochako answered. The two ringleaders escaped, but All Might, Verdant, and Mr. Aizawa handled most of the villains. People are still scattered around the building, though, and 13 needs medical attention now. The principal and teachers launched into action, and Ochako turned back to the stairs to see Verdant frantically rushing up the stairs with her son in her arms, and the state of her friend broke her heart. Today was certainly not a good day. Bakugo was sure that he would die a slow, horrible death from boredom long before Deku's mom could kill him and make it look like an accident. No, not Deku. He's Izuku. He earned that. Deku died when he developed a quirk and trained himself into the ground to become even stronger than himself. He watched the interview that the Izuku did the day prior, and he vaguely alluded to the fact that he trained as hard as he could even before developing his quirk. It meant that even when they were still in school together, Izuku was working his ass off to get stronger, just like he was. That begged the question, though, did Izuku become as powerful as he was in part because Auntie and Co was training him? The woman was terrifying when she wanted to be, and if she really was a retired pro, it would make sense if she was a ridiculous taskmaster during training. He was kind of curious about what she looked like in action. Thinking about that, or literally anything at all, was better than succumbing to the boredom of sitting in a small, almost empty room during heroics classes as part of his punishment. Because he was barred from participating, he was relegated to a forced study hall with one of the civilian teaching assistants where he'd just get his homework done in silence. It was closer to detention than anything else, which he became familiar enough with after transferring schools years prior. Attention, students and staff of UA, due to unforeseen circumstances, classes will conclude early once again, and everyone is dismissed. To all of our UA family, please keep of any and all email updates, and have a safe journey home. The announcement from the principal drew the confusion of both Bakugo and the Ta assigned to watch him. Bakugo shot the man a questioning look, and the man simply shrugged and motioned for him to leave. Bakugo packed his things into his bag and left the room, falling into the sea of equally confused students that were making their way to the exits. After shooting a short text to his mother that he'd be home early, he left the school grounds and set off towards the train station. The train ride and following walk back to his house was quiet enough for Bakugo to retreat into his mind once again. His thoughts centered around Izuku and his strength, as well as the mountain of information he was given the day prior. His entire worldview had been all but flipped onto its head in the space of a single day, and there was apparently a pro whose devotion to being the best warped him enough to abuse the family he created solely to be the best in his stead. The thought alone just about made his skin crawl, but the possibility that he was headed down a similarly warped path in his own devotion made him physically shudder. Conversely, surpassing All Might and proving to have no equal was his entire motivation for being the best. If he had to completely rethink his desire to be the best, where would he even begin? He knew how he didn't want to become the best, but knowing what path to not go down wasn't the same as knowing what the right path was. Was there even a right path? Was it one of those questions where there were no right answers, but there were certainly wrong ones? So caught up in his thoughts, he ignored the people crowding around a screen broadcasting a news report of the developing situation at the USJ. When he made it home, he shouted a quick "I'm home" to his mother, and he received an equally loud welcome back, Brad, in return. He would ordinarily head right up to his room, but he stood ahead of the front door for a moment before heading to where he heard his mother's voice from the living room. "Hey, Hag," Bakugo addressed with far less bite than normal, something his mother immediately noticed. "What is it, you little shit?" she responded in kind, no antagonism in her tone to speak of. "How come you never told me that Auntie and Co was a pro?" he questioned. She frowned before a tired sigh escaped her. "It wasn't my story to tell. She has a difficult relationship with heroics. Do you know what happened to make her lose faith in heroics?" "Yes, and if she didn't tell you, I won't either. Like I said, it's not my story to tell, and I'm surprised she told you even as much as she did." At the surprise in his eyes, she narrowed her gaze at him. "Yeah, she told me about the conversation you two had. Like I said last night, I thought you had gotten over your obsession with proving your dominance over Izuku. I'm glad she chose to talk to you and give you a chance to get your goddamn shit together rather than throw you to the wolves for trying to hurt her son. If anyone's the wolf, it's her," he muttered. "Damn right," his mother chuckled. "She's always been like that, super protective of everything she cares about, and that includes you." Her face became serious once more, and her eyes were pleading. "Don't screw this up, Katsuki, please." Bakugo was taken aback by the near desperation in her tone, and it brought his thoughts to another important detail. "Do you think that I'll become like that guy that abused your other friend if I keep trying to be the best?" His mother's eyes went wide at the question, and she didn't immediately respond, so he continued. "I don't know what she wants me to do, if she wants me to give up being the best entirely or if she wants me to find another way than chasing after All Might." His red eyes became hard. "Like hell I'm giving up on being the best," he snarled out, and then his expression fell just as quickly. "But All Might is the standard for greatness. If that's unattainable, what the hell am I even chasing? And if chasing that standard turns me into..." His mother's own red eyes softened as he trailed off. "I don't think Inko wants or expects you to give up being the best. No one worth listening to does," she assured him. "Your problem wasn't and still isn't that you want to be the best. Your problem was that you already thought you were, and you didn't know how to handle it when someone knocked you off your throne." She placed a tender hand on his shoulder and looked him in the eye with a loving smile. "I know you can be the best goddamn hero Japan has ever seen. We just don't want you to lose yourself along the way and become someone you're not, whether that be a monster that abuses his family or a homicidal puppet for the HPSC. "Oh, what?" Bakugo questioned, completely flummoxed at that last example. Mitsuki immediately winced when she realized what she said. "Shit, I probably shouldn't have said that. Again, it isn't my story to tell." Bakugo narrowed his eyes at his mother. He'd leave it alone for now, but they would revisit that conversation in the future. Mitsuki, meanwhile, tried to hastily change the subject by seeing what was on TV. While flipping through channels, she landed on a news report that had UA in the headline. "Situation is still developing, but as of now, no students have been fatally injured in the attack." what the both mother and son remarked simultaneously. Izuku was becoming a little fed up with waking up to the sight of a white ceiling and the smell of disinfectant. Whatever he did to end up in a hospital bed again better have been worth it, as he was certain that he wasn't going to avoid another thwack from recovery girl's cane. Then, the memories of the day started to come back to him in waves: the attack on the USJ, escaping the shipwreck with Mineta and Tsu, fighting Shigaraki, and the Namu, getting beaten by the Namu, destroying his arm in an attempt to subdue the Namu and using the rest of his energy to heal Tsu in lieu of himself. Oh, right. There was one final thing that happened before he lost consciousness. He didn't want to think about it. He really didn't. He knew that he couldn't avoid it forever, but he would for damn sure try. The light sounds of shuffling beside him brought his attention to his bedside to see his mother waking up in her chair. When the two pairs of green eyes met, one lit up in a powerful mixture of relief and worry, while the other was more than happy to provide succor. "Izuku, I'm so glad you're okay," Enko expressed while gingerly wrapping him in a hug to avoid hurting his heavily bandaged right arm any further. "What happened after I went out? Is everyone else okay?" he asked in concern. To which his mother smiled at him. "Mostly, yes. All Might and I arrived shortly after you lost consciousness from what I was told. The villains were dealt with, but the ringleader and his warper managed to escape." "What about Mr. Aizawa and 13?" he pressed. "They weren't in great shape, and they'll be in the hospital for a bit alongside you, but they'll both likely make full recoveries," she assured. "None of your classmates were seriously hurt either, in part because of you. I got the story from the students who were watching the scene unfold from the entrance as well as the two who were with you." She gave him the warmest tearful smile she could muster while softly running her hand through his curly hair, and he instinctively leaned into her touch. "I cannot express in words just how proud of you I am. You shouldn't have had to have been in that situation, but you handled it expertly, and you even chose to heal a comrade before yourself. You're already a fantastic hero, son." Izuku wanted to believe that. He wanted so desperately to latch onto that glowing praise and let it warm him as long as he could, just like when he was 5 and was initially misdiagnosed. However, also just as when he was 5, something was preventing him. "Izuku," his mother began, her face now deedy with sadness and concern. "Do you want to talk about what happened?" His throat went bone dry. She knew, of course, she knew. No one would keep that a secret, and no one should expect anyone to. He was not a hero. He was a murderer. "Izuku," she said a touch more firmly, yanking him out of his spiral. "It wasn't your fault." Izuku held himself together as best as he could, but he could no longer meet her eyes. "It wasn't your fault. Sometimes, things just happen, especially when your life and the lives of others are on the line. It doesn't make you any less of a hero, and it doesn't make you a murderer, either." Izuku was starting to shake. He still would not meet his mother's gaze. Enko drew him into a soft, loving hug, and she started rubbing his scalp again. "You did what had to be done, sweetie. He was going to kill you and then use your body to kill your classmates. You saved yourself, your classmates, and countless other future lives. You're a true hero, Izuku." "And the dam broke." Izuku burst into tears and latched onto his mother as tightly as he could with his injuries, and he bawled into her shoulder. There they sat for the next few minutes as Izuku poured out all of his distress through his tears and his mother gently comforted him all the while. I didn't mean to." Izuku choked out after his sobbing died down. "I know you didn't," she assured in a whisper. "And no one ever enjoys it, especially when it's the only option." A silence fell between them, and Izuku's tears mostly dried up, but he didn't leave his mother's arms. "Does it ever get easier?" he softly asked. "No," she answered. "The moment it does, it's time to step away." Izuku didn't know how to respond to that. He had an inkling that she was speaking from personal experience, but he didn't want to explore that thought at that moment for both of their sakes. He elected to remain in her embrace and enjoy the comfortable silence. That silence was interrupted by a knock at the door. Enko broke the embrace to open it, and All Might in civilian clothes stepped inside with Nezu on his shoulder. "I am here," he bellowed, "to check up on my student." "Izuku, I'm glad to see that you're well," Nezu chirped with a grin. "I'm doing better, I suppose," he hesitantly responded. Nezu solemnly nodded. "I'll be setting you up with regular sessions with Hound Dog. Myself and any other staff are always available as well if you ever need anything." At the teen's nod of acceptance, he continued with a smile. "I must commend you on your valiant efforts in keeping your classmates safe from harm. While I was not there to witness it personally, testimony from both your classmates and your teacher have made it clear that you take after your mother more than you know." "That is correct, young Midoriya," All Might spoke in a tone which indicated that he clearly lacked an inside voice. "You've already proven to have such a strong heroic spirit at such a young age. I have no doubt that you'll be a stellar hero." All Might patted Izuku on the shoulder as he was finishing, and time seemed to freeze for Izuku upon contact. Within an instant, Izuku was inundated with flashes of shadowy figures, around 7 in total. They were surrounded by blue flames and staring directly at him. But they weren't the only ones. He could feel a dark, overwhelming presence looming over him like the feeling of death itself. To the others in the room, all they saw was Izuku freezing upon contact with All Might, and blue flames erupt from the boy's hair before began trickling from his nose, and he collapsed onto his bed. Izuku and Ko shouted in alarm, and the other two immediately surrounded the boy in a panic to figure out what happened. Damn it, Yagi, what the did you do? All Might deflated and hacked up a bit of. I didn't do anything, I swear not intentionally, I don't know what's going on. His heart rate has remained steady, and his vitals aren't fluctuating, Nezu commented upon checking the heart monitor, and then he turned his beady gaze onto the boy's hair. Could this be another activation of his quirk? I don't know, Inko worriedly lamented, and I don't like it. Izuku stood in a pitch-black void surrounded by blue fire. Looking over himself, he found he was blanketed in the sapphire flames as well. Looking around, he spotted a collection of shadowy figures, likely the ones he had seen in those strange visions. He slowly made his way toward them, but as he did, that overwhelming presence of death grew stronger with every step. Pushing onward, he eventually got close enough to see a peculiar sight. The shadowy figures were much less shadowy, and he could make out that most of them were wearing hero costumes. A woman with black hair up in a ponytail was being restrained by a shorter man with a high collar that covered the lower half of his face, and a larger, bald man. Near them, a man with white hair observed the scene with mirth clearly written all over his scarred face, while 3 other figures observed him curiously. Did eighth pass one for all to this boy? One of the men who had his hair in a spiky ponytail asked. No, a man with white hair and green eyes answered. This isn't the usual void where vestiges reside. This is somewhere completely different, and I'm certain it relates to his quirk. Meanwhile, the woman had nearly broken free of her captivity, and had a ravenous look in her eyes that slightly disturbed Izuku. Nana, please calm down, the shorter man helping restrain the woman urged. How can you tell me to calm down? My grandson is right in front of me. I will hug him, the woman bit back. Wait, what grandson? What's going on? Where am I? Izuku hesitantly queried. We were hoping you could shed some light on that for us, the scarred man replied. We're just as unfamiliar with this space as you seem to be. I can answer your questions, came a deathly smooth, androgynous voice reverberating through the void. The oppressive feeling washed over Izuku and the vestiges, and Izuku could barely turn his head to see a massive cat towering over them. The cat was garbed in elegant, white robes and was wearing red prayer beads around its neck. The eerie Cheshire grin it sported was made even more frightening by the massive tanto wrapped in one of its 2 flowing tails. It stared down at them like they were little more than prey, vindictive mirth shining in its slitted eyes of different colors. Wah, what are you? The bald man fearfully spoke through the aura of death. Guess, was its playful reply, its grin only widening to display even more sharp, ferocious teeth. The group was silent for a moment, and then the white-haired man without a scar seemed to brighten in realization before he spoke. Shinigami, he posed. One of them, but correct nonetheless, Yoichi, the newly identified Shinigami answered, maintaining its threatening smile all the while. How do you know his name? One of the others questioned. Isn't it obvious? The Shinigami nearly cackled. I preside over this realm, and it's my job to be familiar with all of the souls that have crossed over. Well, the massive cat's gaze flickered to Izuku and became even more predatory, with the exception of you. You're not dead. Yet. Then, why am I here? The teen asked with such fear that it nearly broke Nana's heart. You, my dear boy, have the privilege of being linked to me through your quirk. You're not the first, and you may not be the last, but it doesn't happen often. Be proud, the Shinigami answered. So that's what these blue flames are, he thought to himself. You're very correct, the Shinigami spoke up. You can hear my thoughts, he asked in a bit of alarm. I can do so much more than that, the Shinigami purred. But it's not about what I can do, it's about what you can do now that you have me. Izuku did not at all like the idea of being tied to a literal death god as part of his quirk, but he couldn't do anything about it. What can I do? With these blue flames you wield, I can grant you a sort of conditional necromancy, it answered. That got the attention of everyone in the void. Conditional, Izuku carefully probed. Nothing comes without a cost, the Shinigami responded with an even sharper grin, if that were even possible. Izuku gulped. So, theoretically, I could bring someone back from the dead, but it would be a life for a life. At this, the Shinigami finally dropped its grin and appeared to pout. Only if you reach too far. Unfortunately, reclaiming a life that was lost within minutes won't put you out of your misery. With that said, it will take you out of commission for anywhere from a few hours to a few days. And any situation you find yourself in where a life was snuffed out prematurely is probably dangerous enough to where reviving that person would result in your death anyway, so it doesn't really matter to me. Your soul will find its way to me regardless. The Cheshire grin returned with newfound danger. And if you try to breathe new life into any of these souls, we'll be seeing each other again very soon. That was quite a bit to take in for both Izuku and the vestiges. Now that the initial fear of the Shinigami had somewhat faded, his mind was clear enough to assess the situation a bit more. He had unlocked a new facet of his quirk, one that gave him a connection with the death god and allowed him to revive the dead with a cost. If he were going off his and his mother's theory about his quirk, it meant that somewhere down the line, one of his ancestors had a necromancy quirk of some kind. He would wonder where the hell that even fit in, but it truly did not matter at that point. What else can I do with the blue fire, if anything else at all, and what should I call you? Do you have a proper name? Are you always going to be around in my head? Izuku asked in rapid succession, overcoming his fear for a brief moment. The Shinigami was genuinely amused at the boy's sudden bout of courage to express his curiosity. You may call me Matatabi, and no, I will not be in your head all of the time. As much as I would love to torture you to insanity, I have responsibilities to tend to. This will likely be the only conversation we ever have, provided you don't find yourself at death's door. As for what else you can do, Metatabi's grin grew even darker. Where's the fun in telling you all of that now? Allowing you to figure it out on your own increases the likelihood that you screw up and kill yourself. Izuku wasn't really sure what he was expecting at that point. If that will be all, then I shall take my leave, Metatabi declared. You're free to leave this realm at your leisure. Wait, shouted Nana before she broke away from her restraints and made a frantic break for Izuku, ignoring the shouts from the group behind her. Izuku, surprisingly to even himself, did not put up his guard when the woman darted toward him. Something about her intrigued him. Even from afar, she had a similarly calming aura about her to his own mother. He didn't have much time to ponder it even further before he was practically tackled by the woman, and he realized that she was crying. I can't believe it, she choked out through sobs. You're real, you're here, I can touch you. Izuku tentatively returned the embrace, and it felt as though a switch had flipped because he immediately tightened the hold and rubbed her back while she cried into his shoulder. I wish I could apologize to Kotaro and Inko. She started back up through her tears. I wish I could have been there to see them grow, to see you grow. It was just too dangerous for them. She fixed him with a kind, tearful smile. I see Inko grew up just fine if you're any indication. How is Kotaro? I didn't know I had an uncle, Izuku hesitantly responded. He really didn't want to upset the grandmother he was meeting for the first time, but he also wouldn't lie to her. She was downcast at the response, but she nodded in understanding. She looked around to find that Metatabi and the other vestiges had left, and the two were alone amongst the flames. I can only see through Toshi's eyes. I can't speak to him or influence him at all, so please tell Toshi and Inko that I'm so sorry, and that I'm so proud of both of them, just like I'm so proud of you, Izuku. I wish we could talk for longer, but everyone is really worried for you in the living world. She hugged him one final time and ruffled his hair with a sad smile. Be the best damn hero you can be, and don't ever stop smiling. If you really want to be a hero for the forgotten, then a smile is the very least you can offer them when trying to help. And with that, she stood up and backed away from him, fading from the void. Izuku was left alone to take in the encounter amongst the inexplicable chill of the blue fire engulfing and surrounding him. After a deep breath, he closed his eyes and felt the abyss engulf him. Yagi, I swear to every god imaginable, if my son doesn't wake up, I will beat you to death with your own kneecaps, Inko practically snarled. Toshinori had long since taken to cowering behind Nezu to escape the wrath of the boy's mother. Luckily, none of the doctors and nurses that entered to room to monitor the situation had seen him deflate, so his secret was still safe. But it was still too early to say the same for himself as they waited outside of the hospital room for any updates whatsoever. When the door finally opened, the three snapped to attention. He's awake, came the reassuring voice of the nurse. Inko felt the weight of a planet lift from her shoulders, and she melted into her chair. What happened to him? She asked the nurse. We believe that it was an involuntary quirk awakening, and he confirmed as much. While not particularly common, it isn't unheard of for quirks to evolve and strengthen during or after intensely stressful situations. We want to keep him under observation for a little while longer, but he's relatively fine, the nurse answered. Thank goodness. Can we see him? Inko asked. The nurse nodded and allowed the three to enter. Izuku was sitting up in his bed and staring down at his hands. He turned his attention to the new arrivals, and he spared the skinny form of Toshinori a curious glance. Mr. Yagi, he questioned. What are you doing here and where's All Might? Toshinori panicked, forgetting that he came in as All Might and that he had already met the boy in his deflated form. Inko, thoroughly exhausted with the man, offered him respite from the predicament. He's All Might's secretary, she tiredly began. All Might couldn't stick around, so Yagi here decided to stay and keep an eye on you in his stead. Izuku blankly examined the skinny man, and he turned an equally blank eye back to his mother, who quirked an eyebrow at him in return. He turned his gaze back to Toshinori, and a small, white flame ignited in his hair. Toshinori was startled, but a wave of Nezu's paw kept him from moving. Izuku stared at Toshinori for 10 uninterrupted seconds, then he finally faced his mother again with a furrowed, disbelieving brow. Really? What she asked, curious as to how he already figured it out. He didn't give her a reply, only facing Toshinori again with an unimpressed stare. The white flame in his hair extinguished, and he raised his left hand. He activated his quirk, and his hand became coated with the familiar spatter of colored fire. After a good bit of concentration, he successfully managed to bring forth the sapphire flame he had become acquainted with. The eyes of the other occupants went wide as he pushed his hand in the direction of Toshinori. After a few seconds, he felt a light tug on his quirk, and he could vaguely see a faint hand reaching out to him and lightly caress the palm of his hand with its fingers. His suspicions confirmed, he cut off his quirk. Secretary, right? Izuku said dryly. That's your story and you're sticking to it, so that's the story I'll give anyone who asks. The cackle that Nezu unleashed sent shivers down the spines of Aizawa and 13 in their respective hospital rooms. After dodging the inevitable spray of that the tall blonde hacked up, Izuku attempted to ease the man's worries. Don't worry, I won't ask, and it isn't my secret to tell. The relief that bloomed on the man's face was short-lived. However, does it have anything to do with why the ghost of my grandmother is living inside of you? Toshinori did not have any left to hack. So, let me make sure I have everything straight. And Ko began with a tiredness that not even Aizawa would envy. You unlocked a new facet of your quirk when All Might patted you on the shoulder. Izuku nodded. In doing so, you were transported to a void wherein you met 7 dead heroes that inhabit All Might's quirk. Izuku nodded. Alongside them, you were face to face with the Shinigami itself, and it revealed that this new facet of your quirk links you directly to it, and you are granted conditional necromancy when you use these new, blue flames. Misusing this necromancy can kill you. Izuku nodded. The Shinigami is a Nekomata. Izuku nodded. My birth mother is one of the 7 heroes inhabiting All Might's quirk. Izuku nodded. And Ko sank into her chair with a heavy sigh, and she massaged her forehead. What did you two talk about? Not much, in all honesty, Izuku lamented. She was just really happy to see me. She also wanted you to know that she's sorry, and she's incredibly proud of you. Izuku turned away in time to miss the singular tear breakthrough despite Inko's best efforts, and he faced Toshinori. She's proud of you as well. He did catch the tear escape Toshinori's eye that time. He turned to Nezu, who remained quiet as he still had difficulty parsing the eccentricities of human emotions at times. Toshinori soon excused himself, offering a quick ruffle of Izuku's hair before he left. Inko and Nezu followed shortly thereafter, the latter returning to UA to assist with the investigation and to look over the school's entire security system, while the former offered a final hug to her son before muttering something about needing a lot of alcohol. Izuku, now left with only his thoughts, decided to hasten his recovery by applying his pink fire to his arm and ribs since he finally had the stamina to do so. Meanwhile, his thoughts traveled back to the last thing his grandmother had said to him before they departed the void. Be the best damn hero you can be, and don't ever stop smiling. If you really want to be a hero for the forgotten, then a smile is the very least you can offer them when trying to help. Izuku pondered this statement for a long while, long after even his injuries were mostly taken care of. He found that the burns where he remembered the small patches of black flame to be were substantially harder to heal than the rest, but he put it out of his mind for the moment. Maybe if someone saved the sludge villain, it wouldn't have had to end like that. He could feel his mind inching towards a treacherous rabbit hole by broaching that idea, so he shook the thought away. Or maybe someone did try, and it just never took. That line of thinking, he found, wasn't any more comforting than the previous one. It was just exchanging one doomer mindset for another. He didn't know the sludge villain's story. He couldn't make a determination for sure about whether or not anyone had ever really tried to help him or if he was just beyond saving entirely. Maybe the truth was somewhere in the middle shades of gray, and all that. Guess that just means I'll have to work that much harder to help ensure that no one ever becomes too far gone. Tamura Shigaraki was not having a good day. His failed attack on the USJ left him in a broken heap, one that would take him a good while to recover from. If being put on mandatory bed rest because of a cheap, self-insert NPC wasn't bad enough, his sensei specifically called for Kurogiri to bring him to his sensei's own medical chamber for recuperation. Ordinarily, he'd be over the moon, but he just knew that sensei was going to spend that time detailing everywhere he went wrong and why they failed so miserably at killing All Might. He loved sensei, but the man was a petty, condescending asshole at the best of times. He spoke to him in a tone that would sound caring and patient to most who gave a cursory listen, and it did just that to Tamura for years. However, ever so often, Kurogiri would glitch, and it was as if another, more playful personality would force its way to the surface. Those instances were usually rather brief, but Kurogiri would indulge in dry sarcasm, or jokingly talk down to him in a way that would leave for plausible deniability. It wasn't until Tamura became used to those infrequent slips that he started to notice similar speaking patterns from sensei. Only the twinge of joviality he'd get from Kurogiri wasn't there. It just felt manipulative. But that wasn't possible, right? Sensei always had his best interests in mind and wouldn't just manipulate him for his own ends. He was there for Tamura when no one else was. He was there to help Tamura destroy everything he hated. He was there to help Tamura destroy everything that had wronged him in this wretched world. So, why did it feel so fabricated sometimes? Whatever, it was pointless to think about it right then. Anyway, he was stuck in a hospital bed beside Sensei's chair as the man was scouring through any available records on Player 2 and his lineage. So, Izuku Midoriya, HM lone son of Hisashi Midoriya, deceased, and the heavily scarred man paused mid-sentence in surprise. He looked over the records a few more times, and then he perused even further when he found a particularly interesting thread. So that's where you've been all these years, little Inko, the man said with a dark chuckle. If what Tamura told me about his quirk is true, I wonder if your son is the ninth. Sensei, how do you read without any eyes? A long, pregnant silence settled amongst the two. The large man did not answer right away, and Tamura couldn't figure out if he was merely considering the question or if he was upset at him in any way. The lack of a proper face made reading said face practically impossible when he wasn't smiling or frowning. Not well. Class had been cancelled for a few days after the USJ attack. Izuku was surprised to find that his phone had blown up with notifications while he was in the hospital. He expected texts from Achako and Yui, but the rest of his class had apparently gotten a hold of his phone number from either Achako or Ada, and they bombarded his phone with well wishes and questions about his well-being. The outpour of concern and support he received from his classmates was enough to warm his heart, but the lengthy text he received from Sue thanking him for everything he did to heal and protect her and Mina just about made him cry. He even got a text from Takage checking up on him after 1B heard about the attack. He'd really have to do something nice for all of them. A few days later, against his mother's wishes for him to take another day to himself after the sludge villain's failed attack, he returned to school alongside everyone else. He was one of the first people in class in an effort to get out in front of the inevitable swarm of attention he was expecting to receive. He was right, as Toru beamed at the sight of him, and even Aoyama expressed his happiness to have a brethren of the Sparkle back in good health. The most odd reaction, however, was from Bakugo. The two teens' eyes met when he arrived, and the usually bombastic blonde became rather pensive. He ultimately decided to hold on to whatever was on his mind, though, and he sat down in his seat in front of Izuku without a word. Izuku would have thought a little more about it, but a similar thing happened with Todoroki shortly afterward. The only difference was that the teens' varied eyes narrowed at him, but much of the animosity that had been there previously was gone. He'd take that as a victory if not for the reminder that the boy's two-toned eyes gave him of Matatabi's own heterochromia. Eventually, amidst the chatter of the news covering them regarding the USJ, their homeroom teacher arrived wrapped head to toe in bandages, much to the shock of the class. The fact that he was even there and walking to boot was a miracle given the condition the Namu had left him in. My well-being is irrelevant, he grumbled under the bandages. What's more important is that your fight isn't over yet. The UA Sports Festival is set to start soon. That elicited the collective excitement and concern of the class. Izuku, while he understood why the sports festival needed to happen given the international importance of the event, was dubious about the prospect of hosting it so soon after a villain attack on students. Luckily, Gyro voiced those concerns that he and many others in the room shared. Apparently, the administration thinks that this is a good way to show that the threat has been handled and our school is safer than ever, plus they're beefing up security compared to past years. Aizawa responded to their concerns. This event is a huge opportunity for all students at UA. It's not something that can be cancelled because of a few villains. Izuku was still a bit skeptical, so he resolved to see Principal Nezu during lunch to express his thoughts. After Aizawa finished his speech and classes proceeded as normal, the excitement for the festival was noticeably bubbling amongst the students. When the bell for lunch rang, that excitement only became more apparent. Izuku gathered his things to head to the principal's office, but he stopped to intercept a hand sneaking up on him, and he offered a smile to the expected culprit. Izuku, Ada, let's do our best at the sports festival, Achako said with an intensity that he had never seen from her. No one else in the room thought she was capable of that kind of intensity, either, and the reactions to her declarations ranged from hesitant approval to outright concern. Izuku, on the other hand, fully supported her fervor and opted to join her. Hell yeah, let's do our best, he shouted in agreement and pumped his own fist into the air. She spun to face him and shot him a challenging smile, and they pumped their fists again in unison. We're gonna crush it, the two emphatically declared, much to the growing discomfort of the rest of the class. Once they left the classroom, the three friends engaged in light conversation until Izuku went to split off from them to head to Nezu, but he remembered something. Oh, before I forget, I got you guys something, Izuku spoke up before reaching into his bag. The two looked at him curiously as he pulled out 2 bentos. I wanted to thank the both of you for being the first real friends I've ever had, Izuku began. I don't really talk about my past much, but you both know about the situation with my old district. When they nodded, he continued. I'm not really great at the whole being social thing, and most of my time at UA has been me winging it and hoping for the best, but I really appreciate having the both of you around, especially after what happened at the USJ. I figured I should do something nice in return. With that, he bashfully handed them the bentos, one with a pink bow on it for Achako and one with a dark blue bow for Ida. They wordlessly and gratefully accepted them, Ada launching into a heartfelt speech about friendship and being there for those you care about while Achako silently opened the bento to see what was inside. Her eyes widened when she saw that it was full of matcha. She stared down at the bento of some of the best-looking matcha she had ever laid eyes on, and she completely tuned out everything around her, including Izuku sheepishly trying to deflect the praise Ada was giving him. He did this for me just for being his friend. She looked back at him, and her eyes zeroed in on his right arm. She remembered the absolutely abysmal state it was in at the USJ and what he went through to keep himself and the others alive. He went through all of that, and he still felt like he needed to repay us. Her expression hardened. Someone as kind as him doesn't need to put himself through all of that. He'd run himself ragged if it meant protecting people. I need to get stronger if I want to properly protect myself. We all do, and maybe we could protect him, too. Ochako closed the bento and stepped toward Izuku, drawing the attention of himself and Ida. She, with a face set into righteous determination, hugged Izuku as tightly as she could without dropping the bento. We're gonna crush the sports festival, she resolutely declared a final time before she quickly scampered away to avoid anyone seeing her newly burning cheeks. Izuku had absolutely no idea how to react to the impromptu hug, so he stood in place even after Ochako released the hug and left. He turned a confused eye to Ida only to see him dutifully following after Ochako, and yelling for her to not run in the halls. He blinked and turned around to head to the principal's office, deciding to think about it later. When he arrived, he stood in front of the door without knocking and waited. 10 seconds passed without the door opening, and Izuku grew annoyed. After a few more seconds of nothing happening, he sighed and went to knock. Before he could touch the door, it swung open, and Nezu stood before him with a smile. "Ah, young Izuku, I'm glad you've come for a visit," the chimera innocently chirped. "I know you knew that I was coming and that I was at the door," he stated with a hint of frustration, entirely unconvinced by the principal's innocent act. "Why didn't you open it? You didn't knock. How was I to know that you wanted to come in?" An aggravated sigh and a maniacal laugh escaped the teen and animal, respectively, and Izuku entered the room and sat down in front of Nezu's desk. "I have an idea as to what this may be about, but please share with me your concerns," Nezu instructed with a sip of his tea. "Is it wise to have the sports festival as planned given everything that's happened?" Izuku went straight to the point. "As I suspected," Nezu nodded, "your concerns are well-founded. Ordinarily, I would agree that it is a dangerous prospect, indeed, but the sports festival isn't an ordinary event. It is the most highly televised and anticipated event of the year, and it provides our young heroes in training the exposure and opportunity to present themselves to both the public and pro-heroes for their future careers. Canceling it would cause a public relations storm that would be akin to a victory for the villains who attacked the USJ. Izuku expected that answer, as it was along the lines of the explanation Aizawa had given them earlier that morning. Still, he furrowed his brow. "That's the official and likely business-oriented reason. What is your actual reason for moving forward with it?" Nezu's smile returned with a glimpse of his sharp teeth. "I certainly made the right decision all those years ago." He reached into his desk and pulled out a picture. "Do you remember this woman?" Izuku looked down at the photo on the desk, and he nodded in recognition. He wouldn't be able to forget pale blue skin and lilac hair anytime soon. "I suppose you've proven yourself capable enough to be let in on what's currently transpiring." Nezu spoke up at his affirmation. "This woman is Chitose Kazuki, executive director of Shueisha Publishing. We strongly suspect her, and Shueisha by extension, to have strong ties to the Meta Liberation Army." Izuku's eyes widened. "She's the one that interviewed me." "Indeed," Nezu confirmed, "and she's also the one who greenlit the slew of hit pieces directed at UA that you've no doubt encountered. She has been on my radar for some time, but only recently has she made any particularly bold moves. Like showing up in person right on the campus that she's trying to smear." Izuku connected the dots. "You believe that the MLA is subtly fighting back against you for your takedowns of their districts?" Nezu nodded, and Izuku continued. "Do you think that they'd use me as a means of discrediting UA?" "It's not outside of the realm of possibility," Nezu mused. "They may use you and smear your name as a means of discrediting UA, but that isn't what worries me. What worries me is the possibility that now that you, specifically, are in their crosshairs as well, they would use you to smear not just UA, but the public's faith and heroics at large. Shueisha is a large publication with considerable reach and influence, and it is precisely why I did everything in my power to keep what happened to the sludge villain at the USJ under wraps." Izuku flinched at the mention of that little detail. Nezu sighed, and he put his cup down on the desk. "It's very unfortunate that it happened for both the sake of your mental health and your potential career. Villain deaths do happen out in the field, and, under normal circumstances, no one would begrudge you for what happened." Nezu made sure that Izuku was making eye contact with him before he continued. "However, given your declaration to be a beacon for those lost within the cracks of society, a villain death so early in your career will torpedo that notion before you can make any substantial progress with it. Had Shueisha caught wind of it, I have no doubt that they would jump on the opportunity to slander your name and create even more disillusionment among the fringes of society, to draw people to their cause, as well as chipping away at the faith the general public has in hero institutions. If someone with as noble of intentions as yourself was forced to take a life not a week into your very first year, that's, goddammit," Izuku cursed. Nezu nodded in agreement. "That is the reason the sports festival must continue as planned. You will have an opportunity to ingratiate yourself into the hearts and minds of both the general public and those on the fringes of society that are potentially teetering on the edge of villainy. You must get out in front of any potential smear campaigns that Shueisha may undertake against you in the future by building a rapport with the public now." Give them a reason to like you and to want you to succeed, and don't give the MLA any means or opportunity to discredit you. So, wow. Izuku stammered at the information. Nezu patiently waited for him to get his thoughts together, and he was thankful for that. You want me to win the festival and become a media darling? Not necessarily, Nezu answered, picking up his cup of tea once more to take another sip. You don't need to win the whole thing, as much as I'm certain that you will, and you certainly don't need to become a media darling since you've already made it publicly clear that you do not seek to replace All Might. Just be sure to not let them turn you into Endeavor. Think of this as your debut. Make the most of it. Izuku's eyes widened even further as understanding sank in, and he determinedly nodded. Got it. Excellent, Nezu nodded with a feral smile. The end of the school day provided a rather peculiar situation for Class 1A. They attempted to leave the room, but they found themselves blocked by a mass of students from the other classes. A few in 1A nervously looked at the group of interlopers. Izuku looked on in curiosity, Bakugo stared in dismissive annoyance, and Todoroki remained as impassive as ever. Why the heck are you all here? Ochako finally questioned. Do you students have some kind of business with our class? Ida sternly asked. Why are you blocking the doorway? Maida spoke up in near hysterics. I won't let you hold us hostage. They're scouting the competition, idiots, Bakugo calmly answered as he strolled toward the doorway. You all survived a villain attack, and they want to see the class that did with their own eyes. He stopped in front of the doorway and took in the sight, shooting everyone a cold glare. At least you all now know what a future pro looks like. Now move it, X. He stopped himself before he could utter the word, and his face twisted into a frown instead. So, this is Class 1A, how came a lazy drawl from within the mob. I heard you guys were impressive, but you just sound like an ass. Is everyone in the hero course delusional, or just you? Linda, Ochako, and Ada were continually mortified at the situation that Bakugo got them into by being rude and dismissive toward them. But Izuku only continued observing as a tall boy with a messy head of purple hair and eyes to match nonchalantly pushed his way to the front of the crowd to face them directly. How sad to come here and find a bunch of egomaniacs, he cynically lamented. I wanted to be in the hero course, but like many others here, I was forced to choose a different track. Such is life. Shinso ran his gaze over the rest of the class. I didn't cut it the first time around, but I have another chance. If any of us in general studies, business, or even support do well enough in the sports festival, our teachers can decide to transfer us into the hero course, and they'll have to transfer some of you all out to make room. Maybe some of my peers are here to scout out the competition. But I'm here to tell you directly that if you don't bring your very best, I'll steal your spot right from under you. Consider this a declaration of war. His purple eyes finally landed on Izuku, and his gaze narrowed. Oh, I recognize you. You're the special kid who wants to be a savior for the downtrodden even though you hit the genetic lottery and left them behind. Anyway, you're not even a pro yet, and you're already spouting empty platitudes. Some turned to face Izuku in a mixture of concern and curiosity at how he'd respond, while others looked on in indignation. Hey, don't talk to our class rep like that, Minda shouted in Izuku's defense. He's already more of a hero than you could ever hope to. He was cut off by Izuku placing a hand on his shoulder, and he looked up to see Izuku staring blankly at the purple-haired boy. He, Ochako, and Ada all wanted to speak on his behalf, but a certain gleam in his eyes that betrayed the blankness of his face compelled them to take a step back and let him handle it. Izuku slowly meandered toward the door through the tense silence that fell amongst everyone in both the room and the hallway. Bakugo turned his head back to look at Izuku, and even he opted to step aside once he saw something familiar in Izuku's gaze. That did not escape the notice of anyone in 1A. Many clamped their mouths shut and kept an eye on their friend and classmate, and Todoroki was now paying attention to the scene. All the while, Izuku had not yet uttered a single word, offering only a blank, assessing gaze to the taller teen that got under his skin. What? Nothing to say. Am I not far enough in the cracks to be worth your esteemed breath? He tried to prod the green head. Izuku still did not respond, and his emerald eyes only continued roving over the boy like he was up for dissection in a biology class. Izuku only removed his eyes from him to observe an even taller boy with silver hair prepare to shout something. But a detached hand grabbed onto his head, and his gaze flickered to the form of Takage quickly shaking her head at the taller boy to keep him from getting involved. When he brought his eyes back to the purple pair in front of him, he observed a concoction of frustration and festering resentment. The purple boy was going to speak again, likely to spit out another scathing remark, but he was interrupted by Izuku poking his abdomen. It took him so off guard that he did nothing to stop the boy from pushing his finger into different places on his abdomen, and then grabbing and feeling up his arm. His wits returned to him, and he snatched his arm away. The hell are you doing? He spat. You made a declaration of war, Izuku began while cupping his chin as if assessing him even further, but from what I can tell, I'm not confident that you could back it up. That really irked the purple boy, and the slight chorus of oohs from the gathering of students wasn't helping. I mean, your arms have no definition to speak of, and you're a little pudgy in the midsection, he continued, ignoring the growing snickers from his classmates and looks of disbelief and amusement from the interlopers. You kind of got this skin-a-fat thing going on that your height probably draws attention away from. But height only matters in a fight when the combatants are on equal footing, and I don't think you're physically on equal footing with anyone in either heroics class. He took a look around the increasingly red teen in front of him to gaze at the other, witty-eyed students surrounding them. Frankly, I really doubt that you're on equal footing with many in general studies, business, or support. That did it, and many of the students in attendance could no longer contain their laughter. 1A transitioned from silently cheering on their class rep to actively cheering him on, and he even spied the toothy, approving grin of talkage amongst the crowd. Ada, however, was beginning to have flashbacks to their unfortunate interaction at the entrance exam, and he did not envy the purple teen's position whatsoever. Izuku, still maintaining his blank countenance, refocused his gaze on the practically snarling boy in front of him. I really don't recommend looking past your compatriots and challenging anyone in heroics directly. Not only are you punching way above your weight class, you're also prematurely discounting the efforts of those in your class who have probably worked even harder than you. That's the fastest path to failure and being swiftly overtaken. I'm not saying that you shouldn't shoot for the stars. You should always want better for yourself and strive to get there. The problem here is that you're declaring yourself to be among the stars when you've never taken the time to build the spaceship to get yourself there. Build that spaceship first, then meet me on the moon, alright. Whatever indignation the tall boy with silver hair was feeling at 1A's perceived arrogance was gone, and he had joined the rest of the mob in trying to decipher if Izuku was attempting to motivate the other boy or if he was just being exceptionally petty in his response to the boy's earlier digs at him. Either way, the green-haired boy wasn't wrong, and he had succeeded in energizing many in the crowd by acknowledging their hard work and indirectly motivating them to show it off at the sports festival. Now, if you'll excuse us, Izuku continued, there's a sports festival in 2 weeks that we all need to work our asses to the bone for. Bring your best, because we're all going to be bringing ours. With that, Izuku pushed past the seething teen and through the miasma of determination and excitement, high-fiving a familiar floating hand on his way out of the crowd. The rest of 1A and the crowd at large was pumped and ready to give it their all. Shinso, meanwhile, was apoplectic at being very eviscerated so succinctly. It stung that everyone watched it happen and even laughed at him as it progressed, but it stung even more that Izuku wasn't exactly wrong in his assessment. It just fueled his anger and resolve even further to shut the green-haired piece of shit up for good. Like the rest of the group, he was really looking forward to the sports festival. Unlike the rest of the group, however, he did not notice that Izuku never once mentioned anything about quirks in his assessment. Inko had been finishing up dinner while Izuku was in his room when she heard a knock at the door. Assuring Izuku that she'd get it and lowering the heat on the stove, she made her way to the front door before looking through the peephole, and who she saw surprised her. She opened the door to see a nervous Achako lightly clutching her left arm and struggling to meet her gaze. "Achako, it's lovely to see you," she said with a welcoming smile. "Izuku didn't tell me you were coming, but I think I made enough to make you a plate." "Oh, no, I'm not here for dinner," she spastically corrected with a wave of her arms. I came to ask you something." "Oh, what is it?" she inquired while motioning the girl inside and to the living room. "Well," she lowly began, trying to gather up the courage. Izuku poked his head into the living room to see what was happening, and he was surprised to see Achako with his mother. Achako saw him, and their eyes met. It made her think back to the bento of Machai, and she instantly found the resolve she needed. "I want you to train me, Mrs. Midoriya." Izuku's eyes widened to the size of dinner plates, and he promptly disappeared in a yellow flashback to his room. Inko was too surprised by her declaration to chuckle at her son's antics, and a large smile washed over her face. "I was waiting for you to ask," she admitted. "I've wanted to since I brought it up after the entrance exam. Izuku is an excellent fighter, but he can afford to be more explosive and bombastic with his offense given his quirk. You and I, however, could do quite a lot together." "You really think so?" she asked with both hope and disbelief in her tone. "Absolutely," she answered with the same smile. Achako beamed at that, and the determination she had been feeling all day surged through her once more. "Then please train me as hard as you trained Izuku for the sports festival." "Do you want to be able to walk by the time the sports festival arrives?" she asked the girl after a pause. Just as quickly, that determination vanished and wariness overcame her. Preferably," Inko hummed in consideration. "We'll pace ourselves and see where we end up by then." Right," Achako hesitantly nodded. "Thank you so much, Mrs. Midoriya." "I told you that you can just call me Inko," she assured. "I'm not even married anymore. Can I call you Sensei?" Achako compromised. "That works for me," she acquiesced. "Are you sure you don't want to stay for dinner?" "I'd love to, but I'm sure," she politely declined. "My parents are actually coming in to visit tonight, and I'm going out to eat with them." "Oh, that's lovely. I hope you have a great time," Inko responded, and then her smile became predatory and her eyes shadowed. "We'll start your training tomorrow after classes end for the day. Don't worry about finding me, I'll find you." On that note, Achako hastily made her way out of the apartment and away from the sense of danger she was getting from Inko. On her way down the hall, she passed by a short, old man with scruffy, gray hair and a cane heading in the direction of the apartment. She then felt her phone vibrate, and she saw that it was a text from Izuku. "Let me know when you need healing." Don't you mean if? No. Achako was truly wondering if she had made a mistake. Meanwhile, Inko was chuckling at her new student's hasty exit. She was going to have a blast with the challenge of turning her into a world beater. She was on the way to the kitchen to set the table and make their plates when there was another knock at the door. Curious, she returned to see if Achako had forgotten something. But she didn't see the girl in the peephole. Instead, it was an older man. "Hello, can I help you?" she asked the man after opening the door. The man's eyes widened for an instant before he schooled his features. "Are you Izuku Midoriya?" "Yes, may I ask who you are?" she carefully probed. "My name is Sorahiko Torino," the man gruffly stated. "I was a friend of your mother." Inko stared at him with utmost seriousness, and he returned her gaze in kind. "Akutani or Shimura?" she finally asked. "Shimura," he answered simply. She nodded and stepped aside to allow him into the apartment. She led him to the living room before she went to the kitchen and turned off the stove entirely, putting a lid on every pot to keep the food warm before returning to the living room. "So, you knew my mother," Inko stated as she sat down in a chair while Torino found himself on the couch. "Yes, I did," he answered with a bit of sorrow. "She was one of my closest friends. Probably my best friend, honestly." She took that in and remained quiet for a few moments. "Did you know about us, Kotaro and I?" "Yes," he answered with a sigh and a downcast expression. "She had to give you two up after your father died. Things were becoming much too dangerous for her and you both, and she didn't want anything to happen to either of you." "I figured as much," she answered with a sigh of her own, and, at Torino's quizzical expression, she continued. "Yagi told us about everything. I know that my mother was the previous wielder of the quirk before him, so whatever or whoever put him in the state he is now was likely the one who killed her." Torino was not expecting that. Tashinori had only told him that he found Nana's daughter. He hadn't been under the impression that the oaf told her the whole story as well. "Why did he tell you all of that, if I may ask?" Torino questioned. He didn't want to offend Inko, and if anyone had the right to know what happened to Nana, it was her, but the information was privileged for a reason. "That would be due to my son," she answered with a fond smile. "The son who thinks he's being sneaky in his efforts to eavesdrop on the conversation." A frantic shuffle from the hallway resulted in a thud and a hushed shit before he sheepishly entered the living room. Torino turned an amused eye to him and looked him over. Recognition then flashed in his aged eyes, and he assessed the boy even more carefully. "So, you're the kid who wants to help those that slip through the cracks?" Torino questioned. "You saw that, too?" Izuku bashfully asked. "You'd be hard-pressed to find someone who hasn't by now, especially after the USJ attack. I wouldn't be surprised if people are pushing it just to jump on you at the first scent of," he mused. "Well, you're not totally wrong there," Izuku lamented with a sigh. "I'm surprised to see Gran Torino of all people in my house." It was Torino's turn to be surprised. "I'm surprised you even know about an old fart like me. I did a bit of research after I learned about my grandma," he explained. "It started with trying to figure out what happened to my uncle, and then I just fell down the rabbit hole and discovered that you two were in quite a few photos together. I figured you were pretty close with her." Torino's expression fell at the mention of Nana's son, and both mother and child noticed. "I haven't seen my brother since we were separated in foster care," Inko revealed. "The families that adopted us didn't want a duo, and the orphanage didn't really care about keeping us together, so they split us up. I was only 4, and by the time I was even able to really think about what happened, I was afraid of what I might have found if I went looking. To this day, I don't know what happened to him." Torino sighed. "I tried to keep an eye on the both of you in the aftermath, but the family that adopted you skipped town right afterward, and I never knew their names. Kotaro was easier to find since he kept his surname, probably because he was a little older than you were. About 15 years ago, he and his family were killed in their home. It was probably quirk-related, since they were all reduced to dust. He had a wife and 2 kids, but no one survived. They were reduced to dust," Izuku pondered. Inko remained quiet for a few minutes. No one said anything, and Izuku only disregarded his own thoughts for the moment to approach his mom and rub her back. She wasn't crying, but he could clearly see from the strangled distress on her face that it was really affecting her. She gave him a warm smile in gratitude for his support, and she quietly assured him that she was okay. "You look just like her, you know," Torino spoke up again. "You both do." He took a few moments to focus on Izuku. "Did Tashinori pass the quirk on to you?" "Oh, no, not at all," he quickly denied. "Not for lack of trying," Inko muttered. "My quirk is really complicated," Izuku continued, missing his mother's comment while Torino hadn't, and another aspect of it awakened while I was in the hospital. Apparently, I can talk to ghosts now, among other things, and I was able to briefly meet and speak with Grandma Nana through All Might's quirk as a medium." For the 3rd time that evening, Torino was surprised again. That was quite a nugget of information to have. "Your quirk allows you to speak to the dead." Kind of," he sheepishly replied. "Like I said, it's a really complicated quirk that's multifaceted and pretty contradictory at times." His face lit up when something crossed his mind. "Oh, actually, when I was doing research, I looked into your quirk and fighting style." Izuku paused, and a wave of embarrassment washed over him. "I may have started studying it a bit to apply some of the principles to one of the facets of my quirk." Now, the little zygote had Torino's attention. Not only had he known who he was, but he was actively studying him to improve his own combat prowess. He'd be impressed if he wasn't already biased towards him for being Nana's grandson. "Wanna show me?" Torino asked with a challenging smirk. Before Izuku could quite literally leap at the offer, Inko shut that thought down. "Absolutely not. I will not have you two bouncing off the walls of this household." She then developed a smirk of her own. "That said, you're more than welcome to drop by UA after classes or over tomorrow if you're able. Izuku needs a decent sparring partner to prepare for the sports festival coming up." "I'll be there," Torino chuckled. Sitting in his home with a cup of instant ramen, a chill traveled up Toshinori's spine. He would usually attribute a chill to either Torino or Verdant, but the chill was much worse than usual. That meant that either All for One had returned, or Verdant and Torino would be in the same building as him at the same time. He truly did not know which one he preferred. Izuku practically floated in excitement, and he had to be careful to not activate his quirk and go up in a crimson blaze. The two adults laughed at his excitement, and all three were glad that the atmosphere had been sufficiently lightened. "Torino, would you like to stay for dinner? I'm certain I've made enough for 3, Inko offered. "Sure, I can stick around for a bite," he assented. "I'll be able to get a better grip of this little whippersnapper before tomorrow." Izuku was definitely looking forward to sparring with him. Izuku should not have been looking forward to sparring with him. It was so reminiscent of his days training with his mom that he was having trouble accepting the fact that he wasn't trapped in a time loop. Or perhaps that was just a concussion. He couldn't really be sure. "I may have gone a little overboard with that last hit," Torino commented while rubbing the back of his head with his comically bulbous gloves. "You think?" Izuku dryly retorted while still on the ground. "I gotta admit, though, your mom definitely taught you well. You dodge like your life is on the line every single time, Zygote. Because that's never really been inaccurate. What other things come with your quirk?" Izuku sat up and rested a hand doused in pink flame on his head. "Well, there's this." Torino was surprised yet again. "This kid. My quirk has the base form where it's just kaleidoscopic fire that does regular fire stuff, and then it separates into its individual colors, each one providing a different, specific benefit. The pink, as you can see, allows me to heal myself or others at the cost of my stamina. And the yellow you were fighting with enhanced your speed," Torino mused. "Yeah, but only in a straight line and in short bursts thus far," Izuku confirmed. "I can see that. Your movements were often too predictable when you only used the yellow," Torino chided. "What else can you do?" "Well, green improves my strength, white improves my cognitive ability, red allows me to locally superheat things, orange makes shields, but I'm not that great at summoning them, blue gives me necromancy, and I don't really know what black does, but I try to avoid it." "How good are you at using 2 colors at once?" Torino asked, and Izuku only twisted his hand in a so-so motion. "Activate the yellow, and then activate the green on your arms and try to maintain them as long as you can without hurting yourself." Izuku hopped to his feet and did so, letting the bright, yellow flames overtake him before he pushed the emerald to the surface and coated his arms with them. A few wisps of green appeared in specks around his body to spread the strain and prevent it from purely being on his arms. "Good," Torino nodded. "Now, try to keep up this time." Izuku internally heaved a heavy sigh, and he wondered how his classmates were doing with their training. Achako fell to the ground in a boneless, exhausted heap. She now completely understood why Izuku was the way he was. Inko-sensei was a taskmaster among taskmasters. The first thing they did when they entered the training grounds was something called dodge training, which consisted of Inko-sensei pelting her with small, rubber S with accuracy akin to snipes. If that weren't bad enough, she'd use her quirk to yoink the S back to her hand, and Achako would have to dodge those, too. The dodge training continued in the form of spars in which Achako would have to keep from being hit for 3 straight minutes. She hadn't made it past 14 seconds and Kosensei was ridiculously fast, and she hit hard, so contorting her body through the pain to dodge even more strikes was a task in and of itself. Then there were the instances in which the roles were reversed, and she had 3 minutes to land a single hit or negate her gravity. Inko-sensei would stay on the defensive and wouldn't strike back, but she would knock her hands and wrists away at any given opportunity. Achako hadn't landed a single clean hit even once. She refused to give up, though. She would take the torture and see it all the way through. She would get stronger. She would become a great hero and support her struggling family financially. She would become strong enough to protect herself and others so that Izuku didn't always have to. She would become great enough to stand alongside him as an equal. She dragged herself back to her feet, dusted the dirt off of her arms and tank top, and shot a look of pure grit to her sensei while re-entering a fighting stance. "I'm not done yet. Let's do it again." Inko smirked and nodded in approval before entering a defensive stance. "Let's. Everyone, get your game faces on. We're entering the arena," Ida shouted to his classmates in the 1A waiting room. They all had spent the last 2 weeks training themselves to the bone like Izuku Natsusupli suggested in his talk with the tired kid from General Studies. They prepared not only their quirks, but their own bodies, as well. They did not want to be picked apart because they were lacking physically and relied too heavily on their quirks. Conversely, they also didn't want to be one-trick ponies with their quirks, either. Many of them searched for new applications for their quirks, some even asking Izuku for help branching out since branching out seemed to be part of his SH stick, and he was happy to help. The result of one such incident involving confectionery sugar, double-sided tape, a floor covered in sticky S, and 2 angry bears was Izuku receiving a week's ban from ground beta while it was being repaired and the fake city's power grid was being fixed. Midoriya, Todoroki called while approaching the sitting teen. Izuku looked up at the approaching boy with a bit of caution. They hadn't ever spoken much to each other, and Izuku figured that Todoroki just didn't like him a great deal. He motioned for the slightly taller boy to speak while many of the others turned their attention to the interaction. From an objective standpoint, I think it's fairly clear that we're the strongest in the class, he bluntly stated. That drew a few different reactions from the room, Bakugo in particular narrowing his eyes. I suppose, Izuku shrugged. Where's this going? Our first and only bout was interrupted, so there was never a real winner crowned. I can't say for certain who was stronger between us back then. But what is certain is that I will beat you here and now, the boy declared with a nonchalant confidence. Man, what's with all these declarations of war lately? Kaminari joked. Yeah, what's the big deal? Kirishima asked Todoroki. Why are you picking a fight all of a sudden, and right before we get started? We're not here to be each other's friends, he coldly responded while shrugging Kirishima away. Don't forget that this isn't a team effort. Todoroki, Izuku called before the boy could walk away, and Todoroki stopped, but he did not turn around. Like I told the other guy, you're making a mistake by looking past everyone else in your bid for the top. It's the easiest way to be left in the dust. Todoroki finally turned to face him, and Izuku continued. Everyone else in 1A has worked their asses off for this, and they're all gunning for the top, too. Not only that, but 1B is also gunning for the top, and all of the other classes will be fighting tooth and nail just to prove that they belong. He fixed him with an intense stare. You're good, really good. In fact, you're one of the people I'm looking forward to taking on the most. Todoroki was temporarily taken aback by the admission, but he schooled his features before it became apparent, and Izuku continued again. Make no mistake, though, you're not the only good one here. If you want to beat me, fine, but you'll have to make it to me first, and that's not going to be as easy as you think. A proper rematch between us isn't anywhere close to being set in stone because any single one of us can be knocked off by any other one of us if we rest on our laurels for even a single moment. Seriously, why the hell does he ask why we voted for him? Mina whispered to Tsu, who merely shrugged. So, sure, bring it, Izuku continued with a challenging smirk. But know that I don't plan on losing to anyone today. Let me hear you scream as our students make their way to the big stage. This first group aren't strangers to the spotlight. Dazzling, adoring fans and villains alike. Give it up for Hero Class 1A. The cheers and adulation that 1A received were almost overwhelming for them, Izuku included. However, he kept replaying Nezu's words in his mind to keep himself focused. This is my debut, and no MLA is going to stop that. They haven't been getting nearly as much screen time, but rest assured that they are not to be underestimated. Give a warm welcome to Class 1B. The cheers were not as loud as they were for 1A, but the hero students still received their share of praise nonetheless. Izuku looked to the arriving class, and he shot Yui and Takage a thumbs up when he found them. All he received from both girls in return was the gesture of them making horns on their heads with their index fingers. He wasn't sure what that meant, but he rolled with it anyway. Next up, General Studies classes C, D, and E, support classes F, G, and H, and business classes I, J, and K. I get the feeling that we're only here to make the hero kids look good, a General Studies student muttered to another. Speak for yourself, I'm gonna win this whole damn thing, the other General Studies student responded with a confident fist to his other palm. Well, I admire your enthusiasm, I guess, the first one replied. Meanwhile, Shinso was stewing in his rancor. He didn't like having to lay eyes on those arrogant shitheads in the hero course that all had flashy quirks perfectly suited for heroics. But it got even worse when his eyes landed on Midoriya leading the pack. That sanctimonious prick wants to be a hero for the downtrodden, don't make me laugh. It was probably an irrational level of spite, but Shinso just could not help it. Seeing the kid made his boil. He had spent his life up until UA at schools where anyone and everyone would always subtly imply that his quirk was villainous, or that he would use it villainously. Granted, his quirk had some pretty useful applications, so he didn't get it nearly as badly as some others did, but he was never encouraged to seek better for himself or to try for the path of heroics. It was always, cool quirk, bro, don't use it on me, though, as if that was the goddamn expectation. Meanwhile, the green-haired head claimed to have been quirkless at an indoctrination zone and then miraculously developed a ridiculously powerful quirk that he used to leapfrog to the top of the UA entrance exam with only a few years of use. If that wasn't an indictment of UA favoring flashy quirks for their heroics classes, he didn't know what was. And all that talk about working hard for years to get to where he is when he only won the genetic lottery if Shinso decided not to give him the benefit of the doubt. Then the whole thing just sounded like bullshit, especially once he said he wanted to be a hero for the downtrodden. It was the kind of disingenuous drivel that Shinso was so tired of and actively wanted to help wipe out when he became a hero, because he would become a hero. The 2 weeks he spent living in the weight room at UA out of spite was proof of that. He would become a hero. So caught up in his internal ranting was he that he didn't notice that the center of his thoughts was standing at a podium. Nor did he notice the fact that his classmates had backed a great deal away from him when he became progressively redder and started literally steaming. Meanwhile, Izuku had been chosen to give the student pledge, much to his surprise, as he scored the highest on the entrance exam. He made his way to the podium and took a long look at the sold-out stadium of onlookers focused entirely on him. He took another look down at his classmate and competition. Many were looking to him with respect, others were looking on in admiration, some were looking at him with disdain, but most just appeared impassive. Think of this as your debut. Make the most of it. Izuku grabbed the mic and stared directly into the crowd. No one told me I had to make a speech. The resulting silence and the incredulous looks on the faces of both the audience and the other participants at his dry delivery was almost enough to make him laugh. But he held it together despite feeling in his bones that Grandma Nana was laughing her ass off within All Might's quirk. The tension sufficiently broken, it was time to make his mark. A few weeks ago, Class 1A was attacked by villains during a rescue training opus. Thankfully, we all made it out with our lives, but we were lucky to do so. It was a wake-up call, not just for us, but for everyone standing here today. Just because we made it to UA didn't mean that our jobs were finished. We still had to get stronger, we had to get smarter, and we had to become complete heroes. Today is just the first step towards that goal. Today, Class 1A will show that should any villains want to run it back with us, we'll be ready, and we'll be waiting. Class 1B will show that they are just as if not even more dangerous than we are, and they won't lay down for any villain attacks either. The general studies, support, and business classes will show the world that just because they're not in heroics doesn't make them any less capable. Underestimate them at your own risk. And that goes doubly so for those crazy bastards that make our gear in the first place. Within the crowd of students, a short girl with pink dreadlocks and goggles smiled viciously, and several of her classmates gave her a very wide berth. We're the first years of UA, and every generation is said to surpass the previous one. So, get a good look at the future, and survive if we let you. The crowd erupted into a thunderous roar, and many of the other participants gave him a round of applause with dual shouts of "so manly" sprinkled into the group. In the luxury boxes where pro heroes that weren't on security detail were watching, Inko smirked in approval. She'd have to steal that last line. Without further ado, it's time for us to get started with the first fateful game of the festival. Midnight announced to the raucous arena. A large screen behind her began cycling through a lengthy selection of events until it landed on something. The first event is an obstacle course, she excitedly announced. All 11 classes will participate in this treacherous contest. The track is 4 kilometers around the outside of the stadium. So long as you don't leave the track, you may do whatever your heart desires. The competitors collected at the entrance to the track, which was a narrow hallway that led outside of the stadium, and it became even narrower as it went deeper. The students prepared themselves for action, and Izuku readied himself to move at a moment's notice. The countdown steadily reached towards 0, and everyone readied themselves for the fight of their lives. Begin.